10. Trade unionism, hours, and workers' control in the post-war United States. By 1919, the AFL had for more than 3 decades experienced contradictory pressures regarding how to organize, whom to organize, and what to demand. In the wake of Haymarket, the precarious position of the AFL, the fear of the state, and the desire for immigration restriction combined with sexism, racism, and the privileged position of skilled workers, in terms of both wages and control over work, to make for conservatism, craft organization, and susceptibility to the bland dishments of liberal employers' organizations and of nativist politicians. But the sharp limits of corporate liberalism, the substantial militancy of rank-and-file workers, the existence of common-on-the-job experiences among skilled and unskilled workers, and, at times, the strength of American socialism, made the turn to craft conservatism partial and contradictory. In the decade before World War I, with the maturation of managerial attacks on the position of skilled workers and the growth of mass production, initiatives toward amalgamated, federated, and even industrial unionism abounded. As a result, some AFL unions increasingly opened their doors to immigrant, women, and unskilled workers in strikes and organizing campaigns that emphasized workers' control and unified workers around the 8-hour day. The war itself accelerated the growth of such new unions, but also created new opportunities for the AFL leadership to accept junior partnership in a voluntary state, alongside and beneath corporate and governmental officials, and fostered new fears of rank-and-file initiatives. Thus, the labor movement, as it entered the post-war world, was pulled both toward sharply confrontational militancy and toward a government-facilitated détente with management. 1. The sharp confrontations developed quickly in 1919 and featured an explosive combination of hours and control demands. The détente took shape over the next decade and more after the 1919 strikes and witnessed both the divorce of the demand for shorter hours of work from the demand for more control over work, and the greater reliance on the class-neutral arguments of reformers for reductions in the workweek. Arguments for shorter hours and more control increasingly became the province of the far left within the labor movement. 209. The 1919 strike wave, involving at least 4,160,000 workers and 22.5% of the labor force, marked a 20th-century crest of U.S. working-class activity. Recent studies have effectively emphasized that radical demands for more control over work joined wage demands in sparking that wave of strikes. But in the most important 1919 walkouts, those in coal, steel, textiles, and clothing, control demands took the particular form of a call for shortening the hours of labor. Although other issues, including union recognition, were involved, Selig Perlman and Philip Taft were right when they referred to the 1919 strikes as being illustrative of an ongoing theme in this study, as strikes in which shorter hours demands made for greater fellow feeling between trades and industries. In the wake of the defeat of many of the 1919 strikes, AFL unions adopted a far more defensive posture regarding the working day. After having resolved to press for a day of less than 8 hours and to agitate for a 5.5-day working week in 1919, the national AFL downplayed the hours issue in subsequent years. Constituent unions, with the exception of the printers and the left-wing unions in the fur and clothing industries, generally concentrated on holding gains made before 1920. AFL inaction on the working day coincided with a period of labor defeats that saw a diminution in the size of the organized labor movement by over 1.6 million members during the 1920s, a retreat from previous experiments with organization along industrial or quasi-industrial lines, and an abandonment of the struggle against scientific management in favor of emphasis on labor management cooperation to up production. In effect, the historic connection between shorter hours struggles and those over control of work was severed in the 1920s. 2. The ascendancy of William Greene to the AFL presidency in 1924 brought on no rush toward industrial organization nor one toward shorter days, despite Greene's background as chairperson of the AFL Committee on a Shorter Workday and as an official of the UMW, an industrially organized AFL affiliate that fought for the 6-hour day. Under Greene, the AFL did publicize a 5-day week plank in the late 1920s, but so weakly that constituent unions failed to notice the demand. Greene placed any lessening of labor time in the context of enhanced productivity and labor management cooperation. During the first 5 years of his administration, about half the number of workers struck as had in 1919 alone, and hours workweek walkouts were most rare. As in the early 1920s, only a few members of unions managed to reduce the working week significantly. 3. It is doubtless true, as Louis Adamic wrote at the decade's end, that the 1920s saw the struggle of the have-nots against the haves go on unceasingly and relentlessly underneath the surface, despite the repression of unions and left-wing parties. Workers might strike on the job, as Adamic put it, to gain res pedis during the working day. Indeed, Whiting-Williams's participant observations on work in the 1920s probed the relationship between informal restriction of output and explicit trade union or political action to reduce hours. Williams identified taking easy and shortening the working day as alternative working class strategies to prevent increases in productivity from taking away jobs. In the 1920s the former was more often practicable. Point 4. But informal resistance was not accompanied by a sense that industry could be transformed to provide enough free time for a flowering of workers' culture, intellect, or political power. With restrictions on immigration, with the institution of prohibition, and with the burgeoning growth of advertising and of mass media, community-based popular culture came under attack. Left-wing cultural activities suffered from repression against foreign language groups, the IWW, the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party. Given all these constraints, it is small wonder that when Helen and Robert S. Lind studied workers in the industrial city of Muncie, Indiana, in the mid-1920s, their respondents often said they could not imagine what they would do with more leisure. Point 5. Contrasting with the disorientation of the working-class movement for shorter working hours was the activity of reformers. Two distinct reform trends combined efforts, especially in the attack that culminated in success in 1923, on the 12-hour day and the 7-day week in the steel industry. Religious reformers, energized by the report of the Interchurch World Movement on the 1919 steel strike, pressed the case against long hours and Sunday labor largely on the grounds of faith and humanitarianism. A second and ideologically dominant reform trend enlisted the efforts of engineers, efficiency experts, and management consultants interested in the demonstrable effects of leisure on productivity and, to a lesser extent, in shoring up American capitalism generally. Herbert Hoover, the Quaker engineer who served as an activist Secretary of Commerce during the campaign against long hours in steel, united both tendencies. This strong reform impulse, coinciding as it did with prosperity and with the much-heralded, welfare capitalist, initiatives by employers during the 1920s, might have been expected to yield large voluntary reductions of hours. With productivity in the manufacturing sector jumping by as much as 72% between 1919 and 1929, there was ample room for beneficence. Indeed, the shift from a 12-hour day in steel, achieved with little union pressure, and the voluntary granting of the 5-day week by Henry Ford in 1926 secured reduced hours for more workers than any strike of the 1920s. Nonetheless, as a whole, these years of optimal conditions for voluntary reform by employers produced only meager reductions in the working week. According to the figures of the economist John D. Owens, the workweek in non-agricultural industries fell by 7.0 hours between 1906 and 1919 and by just 1.3 hours in the decade thereafter. 6. In many ways the immediate post-World War I period resembled that following the Civil War where labor and the working day were concerned. Though democratic rhetoric and the feeling of sacrifice on labor's part were more tempered following the latter war than after the more heroic former one, the AFL nonetheless affirmed that workers had done their utmost to win the war for democracy, and therefore deserved a shorter working day. 7. The analogy with the post-Civil War period extends to the presence after World War I of a host of leftover grievances, particularly over hours, which accumulated through the war. The New York Harbor witnessed one of the first and most serious strikes resulting from such complaints at a time when the war was scarcely over. Harbor workers, represented by a collection of divided unions, had begun to cooperate in 1913 and by 1917 had united in the Marine Workers Affiliation of the Port of New York, MWA. Employers refused to bargain with the MWA early in the war. In October 1917, a board of arbitrators patched together a wage settlement without ruling on the issues of union security or affiliated bargaining. By January 1918, unions had filed complaints against 200 harbor employers for failure to comply with the award. The following Mach's government investigation of 80 such complaints showed 3 in 4 to be justified. Railroad workers and ship carpenters in the harbor found further unity around a demand for the 8-hour day, a standard that had already been provided by the railroad administration to most other railwaymen nationally. 8. As the war ended, the MWA took up the 8-hour call and a brief strike in late December 1918 brought President Wilson's intervention. Even so, only one private boat owner agreed to enter arbitration on the hours issue. The Labor Board's March 1919 settlement on the issue had but limited application. Moreover, it favored the employers on wage issues and by allowing the 8-hour day to only a handful of harbor crafts representing few workers. A second strike full load, with the result that the railroad administration and other agencies acceded to the shorter day while private owners not involved in government contracted work kept the 10-hour standard. In April 1920, those who had won 8 hours were forced into yet another strike, involving 15,000 marine workers, to defend their gain. 9. The post-World War I period also held one final parallel with the post-Civil War years. In 1865, most craft workers had achieved the 10-hour day and the thrust of postbellum agitation was for a new and visionary 8-hour demand. In 1919, nearly half, 48.6%, of all U.S. agricultural workers had attained the 48-hour week, and a clear majority of organized labor had done so. Gompers had briefly called for a 7-hour day during the war. In weak industries such as mining, Fear of massive unemployment upon demobilization gave force to arguments for new goals regarding the working day, including cuts to well below 8 hours per day. 10. Any study of hours in 1919 must therefore proceed from an acknowledgement of the possibilities and achievements of that year. An unprecedented strike wave, adoption of a variety of hours legislation by 28 states, and passage of yet another ill-fated federal law attempting to find a constitutional way to limit the working day of child laborers. The hours of labor were decidedly a public issue. Farmers in the Nonpartisan League joined labor groups in the Great Plains in calling for 44-hour workweek laws at the state level. The Illinois Independent Labor Party, supported by the Chicago Federation of Labor, campaigned for an 8-hour law and a 44-hour week. Some women's groups called for a 4-hour day. The IWW made the 6-hour, or less, day one of its prime demands and helped to raise the 6-hour issue in the 1919 Butte General Strike and elsewhere. 12 Industrial planners mulled over 6-hour plans, especially in depressed industries. 13. The AFL itself showed signs of moving toward a demand for a sharp reduction in the working day. In 1918, state AFL resolutions in Ohio and California called for days of less than 8 hours. At its 1919 convention, the AFL resolved that the right of labor to fix its hours of work must not be abrogated, abridged, or interfered with. The convention backed 6-hour demands by individual unions, especially the UMW, and caused the New York Times to headline, "Labor will work for 6-hour day." Only in 1921, when a general resolution favoring a 6-hour day with an 8-hour pay came before its convention, did the AFL reject a general call for 6 hours. It was rejected as merely ill-timed. 14. The 1919 shorter hours strikes attempted both to generalize the 8-hour day and to transcend it. The strikes fall into 3 categories. In the coalfields, well organized at the time but plagued by unemployment, the UMW became the first major American union to fight for the 6-hour day. The unions in the clothing trades and in printing sought the 44-hour week. Strikes in the largely unorganized steel and textile industries attempted to enlist workers with very long hours around the demand for a working week of 6, 8-hour days coupled with union recognition. The largest of these strikes were important because, in their goals and vision, they summed up so much of the possibility to be gained by organizing around shorter hours and the new unionism, and because, in their results, they previewed defeats and retreats to come. The long and huge bituminous miners' strike of 1919, which brought John L. Lewis to national prominence, involved 400,000 miners who sought a 6-hour day and a 60% pay increase to compensate for wartime erosion in purchasing power and to make possible the maintenance of piece rate income as hours went down from 48 to 30 weekly. The strike illustrated the intimate connection of hours and control as well as the problems associated with labor's reliance on the voluntary state. Coal mining, probably more than any other U.S. industry, was plagued by overproduction, mismanagement, and seasonal unemployment, and the 30-hour plan was a union response to the chaos. In 1918, despite war orders, an average of 63 of 308 possible working days were lost in the mines. In 1919 this figure rose to 115, with no more than 29 of those attributable to strikes. As Carter Goodrich's 1925 study of miners observed, the famous demand for the 30-hour week was in large part based on the feeling that an industry that on the average provided little more than 30 hours work a week ought to share that work equally among those engaged in it. Mechanization did not necessarily increase efficiency, in part because loaders often waited hours for cars to arrive. Disorganization of loading, especially full load double shifts, and UMW opposition to that practice was in essence an efficiency demand. In sum, the 30-hour week without double shifts constituted a proposal to spread work and rationalize the industry. 15. The issue of government intervention found its way into the miners' strike because mine operators insisted, nearly a year after the armistice, that wartime negotiation procedures still held. The mine owners, backed by the hysterical anti-communist, Red Scare, propaganda so much a part of 1919, maintained at one point that the miners acted on orders from the Soviet Union and, before the strike even began, secured an injunction against it in a statement from President Wilson branding the miners' plans to strike as not only unjustifiable but unlawful. 16. The strike itself featured what one historian has called the most sweeping injunction issued against a major union since the Pullman boycott of 1894. As well as use of wiretaps on Lewis phones and massive threatened deployment of federal troops. 17. Complicating strike strategy was the greater willingness of Gompers than of Lewis to cooperate with federal officials policing the strike. Lewis, then acting president of the UMW, repeatedly defied injunctions but also dropped the 30-hour week demand during negotiations and, after 5 weeks of striking, decided on December 6 to submit to the inevitable, in the face of government pressure, and to accept arbitration. The final settlement won 20 to 34% pay increases but left the working week unchanged. 18. After 1919, the 6-hour day became an issue identified mainly with the large, anti-Lewis left wing in the coal unions. In 1922, the full UMW convention did resolve for a 6-hour day rather than the 8-hour demand proposed by the Resolutions Committee. A call for 6 hours was briefly made and bitterly attacked by employers and legislators in congressional hearings, before being dropped in the huge 1922 strike involving over 600,000 miners. In some minds, even the 8-hour day was then lost. 19 John Brophy's platform in the 1926 UMW presidential election, a vote often said to have been stolen by Lewis, raised a demand for a 30-hour week in the same plank as nationalization. 20 workers later. Communist Party agitation in conjunction with Kansas miners leader Alex Onder Howard and the Trade Union Educational League, TUL, consistently stressed the 6-hour, or 4-hour, day during the early 1920s. In 1928, the 30-hour week was again coupled with nationalization in the program of the Save the Miners Union conferences undertaken by left-wing UMW supporters. 21. In the largest 6-hour strike of the late 1920s, the IWW led a 4-month walkout in the 3 major Colorado coalfields. After a wildcat strike in Colorado mines in early August 1927 to protest the execution of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, IWW organizer A.S. Embry and miner delegates drew up a list of economic demands including a 6-hour day from bank to bank, and mounted an October strike. Repression by the Colorado Rangers and attacks on the strike by the Colorado State Industrial Commission marked the conflict. Planes attempted to break up the strike meetings and the Rangers' Moss Sacred Strike supporters at Columbine, killing 6, and at Walsenburg, where 2 died. The miners won raises but not the 6-hour system. 22. The shorter work week campaigns of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers, International Printing Pressmen and Assistants Union, and the International Typographical Union culminated, just after the war, in a series of strikes for the 44-hour week and, especially in the printing trades, for control issues. Because the strikes in these trades sought mainly a Saturday half-holiday and, later in the 1920s, Saturdays off in a 40-hour week, they are treated more fully separately in discussion of the rise of the 5-day working week. 23. In many industries the 8-hour day was still a dream in 1919. On the street railways, among operating engineers, in the oil fields, in canneries, in textile mills and, most dramatically, in steel mills, days of 10, 12, or more hours continued. In steel, canning, oil, municipal transportation, and domestic service, the 7-day week also persisted for hundreds of thousands of workers. 24 As Grace Hutchins wrote, the very workers most in need of a strong union to demand shorter hours are often too exhausted at night to attend meetings. 25. In 1919, workers in long-hour industries tried to remedy this situation in a series of actions centering on the working day and union recognition. These actions were so particularly concentrated among public workers and those in mass transit as to give the hours issue special prominence. In Chicago, 15,000 public transportation workers struck in late July, causing what Survey magazine called a complete tie-up of elevated and surface trains there. The strikers defied the president of their international, who was held down by a crowd of 4,000 at a ratification meeting. The leadership then asked for a referendum on ending the strike and carried the back-to-work motion by only 386 votes among more than 12,000 cast. The surface train employees especially opposed the settlement. Under the settlement, just 60% of them received the 8-hour day, and working time was spread over as much as 14 hours. Elevated train workers, whose votes gave the pact its margin of victory, did slightly better with 70% gaining an 8-hour day. 26 Many other public workers likewise protested against long working hours in 1919. New York City firefighters supported a socialist-sponsored municipal resolution calling for the introduction of the 3-platoon, 8-hour system in the firehouses. Cleveland witnessed a firefighters' strike over the same issue. The most famous public employee strike of the year, the September walkout of Boston Police, resulted from the refusal of the city government to allow the police to affiliate with the AFL and from the firings of 19 union leaders. However, long hours figured prominently in pre-strike union organizing. 27. Other struggles similarly used shorter hours as a rallying cry. In the Pacific Northwest, lumbermen in the AFL's International Union of Timberworkers, IUT, undertook an 8-hour organizing drive concentrating on those camps in which the government-sponsored Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen had allowed the restoration of longer shifts. The IUT also attempted to extend the 8-hour system to forests throughout the nation. Orange pickers in parts of California unionized around demands for an 8-hour day at $50 per hour. In Kansas City, Afro-American domestic workers, organized by the WTUL in 1918 and 1919, won the 8-hour day and a 67% raise. 28. The most significant instances of organizing around the 8-hour day lay in the textile and steel industries. Organizational banners mattered in the fierce textile strikes of this period, but so too did rank and file initiative and, in virtually all the shorter hours strikes in the industry, the tendency of that demand to unite a particularly diverse working population and to raise issues of control over work applied strongly. The particularly fierce repression which had historically greeted shorter hours struggles was also present in these textile struggles, regardless of the leadership. Competing unions attempted to capitalize on the popularity of the shorter hours demand. With as much as half of its membership in the South following the war, the AFL-affiliated United Textile Workers, UTW, searched for a way to revitalize New England organizing. That search took on special intent city because the UTW leadership favored craft organization, but the union's southern wing was largely organized on an industrial basis. At its November 1918 convention, the UTW planned a northern membership drive keyed to the achievement of the 8-hour day by February 3, 1919.29. At first, the 8-hour drive in northern mills was very successful. In late January, New York Times reports indicated participation by 120,000 New England workers. Conservative UTW President John Golden found many employers ready to grant 48 hours. He signed pacts with the management of large cotton mills in Manchester and Pawtucket, and with some silk producers in Paterson. The huge American Woolen Company in Lawrence also was ready to sign, but opposition to the settlement suddenly developed among workers. 30. Popularity of the UTW's 48-hour contracts eroded as low-wage workers in textiles realized that the 6-hour reduction in hours also entailed over an 11% pay cut, since piece rates and hourly wages were left untouched. In Paterson, where women members of UTW Local 480 struck for maintenance of wages with reduced hours, Golden responded by expelling hundreds of unionists and exposing them to blacklisting. In Lawrence, 20,000 struck against UTW wishes on February 3, chanting, 54 hours pay for 48 hours work, and 25,000 workers joined the walkout. Over half were women, many of them Italian or Polish immigrants, with Lawrence's 31 other nationalities also represented. 31. During the Lawrence struggle, a new textile union matured. Conceived by the Rev. A. J. Must, the Amalgamated Textile Workers, ATW, patterned itself after the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and embraced socialist industrial unionism. The ATW rekindled the embers left in Lawrence, Paterson, and elsewhere by earlier IWW strikes. Affiliation with the AFL was precluded because of the opposition of the UTW. But the textile union could take heart from the advice of Joseph Schlossberg, the ACW's general secretary, who counseled with us the membership rules. That is why we win. And that is why you will win. 32. In Lawrence, ATW tactics harkened back to the wobbly strike of 1912 and included round-the-clock picketing and separate strike meetings for the major national groups involved. Women clashed with the police who, just 4 days after the strike's start, killed a Polish worker. When the strikers voted to turn down a compromise of 48 hours work for 51 hours pay, city officials intensified repression. Backed by police from nearby towns, the local force especially limited picketing by females. A women's delegation tried vainly to visit Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge to protest suspension of civil liberties. 33. By March 7, Lawrence Commissioner of Police Peter Carr denied the strikers' rights to assemble in either public or private places. Carr, by his own account, felt he had to suppress Bolshevist propaganda in a city in which most are foreign. When Must and the ATW responded with large picket lines, a week and a half of conflict and arrests ensued. On March 18, pickets returned gunfire initiated by police, and thereafter the strikers became subject to increasingly frequent clubbings by Carr's men. 34. With misery growing among mill families, with the UTW encouraging strikebreaking, and with part of its leadership driven from town at gunpoint, the Lawrence ATW ended its 15-week strike on May 21. Shortly thereafter, while setting up company unions, mill owners granted the 48-hour week with no wage reduction. It was a voluntary concession fairly bathed in blood. 35. The Lawrence strike publicized the ATW as an alternative to the 8-hour day, with less pay, strategy of the UTW. In Paterson, hatband weavers, ribbon weavers, and broad silk workers broke with the latter union over its cautious bargaining in a February 3, 1919, strike of as many as 27,000 workers who sought the 44-hour week in mills where the 8-hour day was not obtained. The UTW, negotiating with the War Labor Board, agreed to a schedule of 5 8.5-hour days with the prospect of adding a 5.5-hour Saturday shift. In July, the hatband weavers struck without UTW authorization to win the 44-hour standard. After hundreds were expelled by the UTW and after the local ribbon weavers lost their AFL charter, the Associated Silk Weavers formed to unite the two specialized trades. 36. ATW agitation in Paterson started slowly. Before July 10, the union's organizers could find no public hall in which to meet. On July 10, the ATW managed to hold a meeting at the Sons of Italy Hall. 2 of its conveners suffered arrest after speeches that again stressed the working day. The charges against the two expressed the vagaries of Red Scared American justice. Attempt by speech or writing, printing or in any other way whatsoever, to incite or abet, promote or encourage hostility or opposition to the government of the United States or of the state of New Jersey. 37. After this unpromising start, the ATW rapidly organized silk workers in Paterson and led a large strike for the 44-hour week among the broad silk operatives. By August, the 44-hour standard was established in the Paterson silk industry, though employers rescinded it over the next decade. In July 1919, the UTW had claimed 8,500 members in Paterson. In 1920, its local there disbanded. The ATW grew, drawing on wobbly traditions and on the desire for shorter hours not just in Lawrence and Paterson, but also in Passaic, where it led a successful hours strike of 10,000. By its 1920 convention, the ATW had 40,000 to 50,000 members and took credit for igniting a campaign that brought the 48-hour week, and even some shorter schedules, to 250,000 workers. However, the union faded with the economic downturn of the early 1920s in New England textiles. 39. While the UTW's 48-hour campaign boomeranged in the North and ended up generating support for the ATW, the former union did get unexpected results in the South where not much success had been anticipated. On the appointed February 3 date for transition to 8 hours in New England factories, many spontaneous strikes erupted in southern cotton mills. With support from local craft unions, over 10,000 mill hands in the South left their jobs. Barely a third of the strikers in Columbus, Georgia received UTW strike benefits, but the conflict there lasted for more than 2 months before workers went back under the old schedules of more than 10 hours daily. Shortly after their return, management granted a 55-hour week, as had several other Georgia mills and the major South Carolina factories. 40. An 8-hour strike in Macon, Georgia, in August 1919 involved 2,000 operatives from 5 mills and resulted in the deaths of 2 black strikebreakers during an attack by white picketers. The incident signaled the defeat of the strike and exposed the Achilles heel of UTW organizing in the South, the failure to enlist black workers. In North Carolina, 2 1919 summertime settlements in Charlotte and others in Concord and Kannapolis won the 55-hour week at 60 hours pay for over 5,000 mill hands. The UTW claimed 40,000 members in North Carolina by the fall. However, little of this organization survived the Depression of 1921-1922. In 1926, the average Southern millhand worked 55 hours or more weekly in an almost unorganized industry. 41. After 1920, both the UTW and ATW had to assume defensive postures. However, both of these organizations, along with the ephemeral, syndicalist One Big Union, did contribute to the defeat of a series of 1922 efforts by New England employers to cut wages by as much as 20% and to extend the working day. 42. As many as 125,000 New Englanders joined the defensive strikes of 1922, but the tide of unionism continued to ebb. The ATW disbanded shortly thereafter and UTW was virtually moribund from 1922 until 1933. The Associated Silk Workers Union was the only labor organization left in Paterson in 1924 to lead a strike for reinstitution of the 8-hour day, a wage boost, and limits on the number of looms tended by each worker. Though gaining concessions on pay, it failed to regain the 8-hour system. In 1928, the union tried again, leading 30,000 striking silk workers in Paterson in a 3-month walkout for 8 hours. Again defeated, the Associated Silk Workers acknowledged the difficulty of formal textile union activity in the 1920s with the pledge to continue the struggle for the 8-hour day through unceasing guerrilla warfare with individual bosses. 44. With textile union membership falling during the decade by more than 75% from its 1920 peak, shorter hours agitation came to be carried on in the mills largely by explicitly left-wing groups. After having been active in the Paterson strike of 1924, Workers' Communist Party members assumed leadership, between 1926 and 1929, in a series of large and symbolic textile strikes at Passaic, New Bedford, and Gastonia. 45. In each case, the hours of labor were at issue. The National Textile Workers Union, NTWU, formed with communist leadership in 1928 during the New Bedford strike, consistently emphasized the 40-hour week. The communist press praised the Soviet Union's announcements of the implementation of the 8-hour day and its 1927 experimentation with 7-hour shifts. 46. At the same time, the communists rejected the Taylorist strategy with which Soviet planners sought to increase productivity while cutting hours. At least for the United States, the Workers' Party continued to combine demands for shorter hours with an assault on scientific management in an attempt, as James Green puts it, to revive the new unionism. 47. Since the story of the communist-led textile strikes of the 1920s has been told in such detail elsewhere, it is perhaps well to concentrate here on how hours and control issues combined in the most important such strike, and Perhaps the one most expressive of communist attempts to revive and extend new unionism, that at Gastonia, North Carolina, in 1929. Gastonia must be placed, however, in the context of a developing campaign of hours control strikes led by communists at Passaic in 1926, in which 15,000 wool and silk workers walked out, and at New Bedford in 1928, where nearly 30,000 largely unskilled cotton mill workers struck. Though the long New Bedford strike failed, it saw the communist-led NTWU enroll 6,000 new members. 48 Some of those active in New Bedford would find their way to Gastonia, where the new textile union would try to carry its pledge to enforce a 5-day, 40-hour week into the South. Largely as a result of the spectacular strike at Gastonia, NTWU's strategy would confront that of the AFL in the unorganized mills of Dixie. And labor would prophesy, Southern workers will be organized. If this is not done by responsible craft unions, it will be done by the communists. 49. The 1929 Gastonia walkout represents the fullest application of the strategy of promoting class solidarity and industrial unionism through agitation against long hours, Taylorism, and low wages. 50. The origins of the Gastonia conflict were simple. The Luray Mill, under the absentee ownership of the Manville-Jenkins Corporation of Rhode Island, instituted a set of stringent management practices in 1927. Luray workers dramatized this stretch-out system with a street theatrical featuring the parading of a coffin down Gastonia's Main Street. At intervals, an effigy of the manager popped up to lay off pairs of workers, leaving the burden to those who remained to carry the casket. The comedy, as historian George Tyndall has remarked, masked a growing tension. 51. In March 1928, 50 Luray workers struck unsuccessfully to protest the stretch-out and wage cuts. As the year ended, pressured by the local clergy, Manville-Jenkins replaced the superintendent in charge of the speed-ups. The move produced little in the way of reform at an enterprise that had already laid off more than a third of its 3,500 workers while maintaining production levels. Since it took the wages of about 3 persons for an average family to live, such layoffs meant not just much harder labor for those employed, but also increasing debts to the company store. Speed-ups raised the issue of time sharply. As one worker explained, it used to be you could get 5-10 minutes rest now and then. But now they keep a runnin' all the time. 52. Into this cauldron came NTWU and communist organizer Fred Beale in January 1929. Beale, an ex-Wobbly, had helped to lead the New Bedford strike. During the weeks after his arrival in Gastonia, Beale organized a secret union local of about 60 members. When, on March 25, 5 of the unionists were fired after being betrayed by a company spy, Beale convened a public meeting of protest. At that meeting, about 1,000 workers voted to hold a second gathering to discuss recommendations for an immediate strike. The mill management responded with a new round of firings, which helped to solidify a strike by about 90% of the 2,200 Luray employees. 53 In part because a working wife was often a condition of male employment at Luray, most of the strikers were women. 54. On April 3, with the strike 2 days old, the unionists drew up a list of demands that reflected both the general aspirations of the workers and the special ones of the women. These included a 40-hour, 5-day week, down from 60 hours weekly, ending the stretch-out, abolition of piecework, equal pay for equal work for women and children, a $20 weekly minimum wage, a 50% reduction in rent and light charges, sanitary improvements, and union recognition. 55. Mass pickets and parades characterized the early strike. Injunctions kept strike activity away from the mills, but despite the presence of a howitzer company of the National Guard, protests continued. As the labor writer Tom Tippett observed, parades were broken up by force every day, and just as consistently the strikers would form again the following day to march into clubs and rifles. On April 15, with relief slow in arriving and the AFL opposing the strike, the mills partially reopened. 2 days later, a relief depot opened. Strike leaders appeared unfazed by episodic returns to work, with Beale later writing, "The scab of today was the striker of tomorrow." This, and the fact that most of the strikers were related to each other, established a unique attitude on the part of the strikers to the scabs. In Gastonia, the scab was considered merely as a potential striker. I began to organize the scabs to have periodic walkouts to support the regular strike. 56. Local commercial leaders, politicians, newspaper owners, and American legionnaires joined in escalating attacks on the strikers. A mob of hundreds of masked, armed men descended on the relief depot and union headquarters by night on April 18. They destroyed relief supplies and union offices. Local authorities arrested 10 strike supporters, victims in the incident. In May, the company then undertook to break the strike by evicting participants from company housing. 57. Although the National Guard was removed after protests, a committee of 100 ensured, as one historian has put it, the continuance of the reign of terror on the strikers. 58 company supporters played on the fear that blacks might enter the textile labor force in numbers for the first time as strikebreakers. Many communist organizers and local militants, such as the 29-year-old mill worker and balladeer Ella Mae Wiggins, took Albert Weisbord's advice and countenanced absolutely no compromise on the Negro question as they organized among blacks. Their efforts met with but mixed success, and some organizers did bow to local prejudices, but the attempt to apply egalitarian policies further enraged local officials and vigilantes. 59 On June 7, a carload of police moved against the tent colony of evicted strikers. In the ensuing gun battles, Chief of Police O.F. Adderholt was fatally wounded. 75 of the tent colonists suffered arrest, and grand jurors later indicted 16 for murder and 7 for assault. 60. Throughout the summer, the NTWU was more occupied with conducting a defense campaign than a strike. Eventually, charges against 9 of the murder defendants were dropped. The trial saw the prosecution stress communism, atheism, and race mixing, while the defense emphasized the drunkenness of Adderholt and his aides and their lack of legal business at the tent colony. A mistrial event aided on September 7 when a prosecution dramatization featuring a blood-spattered effigy of Adderholt caused an attack of insanity in a juror. 61. Further mob violence greeted the news of the mistrial. A horde of 500 vigilantes again raided the union headquarters, kidnapping and beating strike leaders. A union rally to protest the repression met with more tragic violence on September 14. As they headed for the demonstration, a truckload of unionists encountered 10 automobiles of vigilantes who blocked the road and fired into the group of strikers in broad daylight with 50 witnesses. Ella Mae Wiggins died as a result of the blasts. Those charged with her murder all won acquitals, while jail sentences resulted for all 7 defendants in the Adderholt case. The strike dwindled, gaining none of its original demands, though it did help to bring about the adoption of a 50-hour week at Luray and other area mills. 62. During and after the Gastonia strike and since, a variety of journalists and historians have asked whether the local authorities and state officials opposed revolution or trade unionism. Few have differed much in their conclusions from those of Nation correspondent Paul Blanchard, who doubted that a conservative AFL union would have been any better received during the strike in Gastonia. 63. The brutality occasioned by a large wage strike in Elizabethton, Tennessee, just before Gastonia, and by a conflict over wages and hours in Marion, North Carolina, just after Gastonia, support Blanchard's interpretation. UTW leadership in these instances, as Herbert Lawn observes, was accorded no more peaceful welcome than the communist NTWU. 64. While the coal strike was larger and more extreme in its shorter hours demands, and the textile strikes of 1919 and the 1920s were more protracted, the 1919 steel strike was the pivotal hours conflict of the post-war period. Involving hundreds of thousands of workers in a key industry, uniting the skilled and unskilled, focusing on the 8-hour demand as a key to organizing the unorganized EED, and raising the issues of control over work, the steel strike summed up many of the trends of the previous decade, indeed of the previous century. It also represented a climax of repression of the labor movement and the failed leadership of the AFL. Participants on both sides recognized the steel strike as a watershed in the organization of mass production industries. Its defeat helped to signal the decline of aggressive union organizing and to set the stage for a new series of efforts to reduce the working day in steel, efforts to be more often spearheaded by reformers than by trade unionists. As befits such an epochal conflict, the 1919 steel strike is perhaps the best studied industrial dispute in U.S. history. 65. The shorter hours campaign began in steel while World War I still raged. Fresh from organizing victories in the stockyards, William Z. Foster and the Chi Cago Federation of Labor head John Fitzpatrick turned to the almost unorganized EED steel industry. Foster's proposal for a national steel organizing drive won assent from the CFL and at least lukewarm support from the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers. At the June 1918 AFL convention, the CFL pressed for a conference on steel organizing and succeeded in holding 3 large meetings on the subject. A heady sense of possibility prevailed. Foster saw a victory in steel sparking speedy organization of 5 or 10 million workers. John Fitch asked, if an industry so completely non-union may become organized under the new conception of human rights as formulated at Washington, what may not be possible? 66. From the start, the working day was a main issue in steel, with 8 hours in the union serving as the central organizing slogan. The demand carried special weight in an industry in which long hours of labor continued for most workers. Even according to the estimates provided by U.S. Steel head Albert Gary, nearly 1 production worker in 3 labored 12 hours daily at that corporation in 1919. The Interchurch World Movement, IWM, report suggested that a more accurate figure was over 50% for the whole industry. 67. The corporations, led by Gary, defended such schedules by backpedaling from one position to another. They held, despite firm evidence to the contrary, that the situation was improving, that immigrant workers wanted 12-hour days, that economic and metallurgical necessities made reform impossible, that mechanization made 12-hour shifts bearable. 68. Despite high hopes and desperate grievances, the steel campaign began inauspiciously. Kicking off the organizing with a conference in Chicago on August 1 and 2, 1918, 15 unions with jurisdiction in steel did agree, without debate, to a federated effort. But craft jealousy and disunity remained problems. Gompers presided over the Chicago Conference, and nominally, over its creation, the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers. However, busy with war and reconstruction tasks, he showed little inclination to aid in organizing work and raising funds. Fitzpatrick, as temporary chairman, and Foster, as secretary-treasurer, led the campaign. The Chicago Conference rejected the specifics of Foster's plan for a 6-week wartime organizing blitz in steel and funded the movement with $2,400 rather than the $500,000 he requested. 69. The greatest obstacle to organizing was the denial of free speech to unionists by local governments. Municipal officials, particularly in western Pennsylvania, refused permits for the National Committee to hold meetings. Ed Duquesne, the mayor, brother of a tin company president, proclaimed that Jesus Christ himself could not speak. For the AFL 70, the situation was similar in Monessen, Donora, Homestead, Clarendon, Braddock, and elsewhere. 71. Nevertheless, the organizing drive gathered force. Its leaders executed, as Philip Taft has written, one of the great organizing feats in American labor history. 72. Beginning in the Chicago-Gary area, the National Committee built out ward to Ohio, Colorado, and West Virginia. By early 1919, agitation started in the Pittsburgh region, where opposition was fierce. The unions used wartime protections of the right to organize ably, and the National Committee applied the rhetoric surrounding the war effort to labor at home. 73. In the union's case was presented in the immigrants' languages through foreign language bulletins and the words of over 24 multilingual organizers. 74. The skills of the steel organizers shone most clearly in the campaign for free speech in Pennsylvania. 75. Foster and others defied bans on free speech in illegal street meetings. A flying squadron of organizers faced down death threats and endured arrest to restore civil liberties in city after city. On August 20, 1919, Mother Jones, nearing her 90th birthday, asked in a speech in Homestead whether the town belongs to Kaiser Gary or Uncle Sam. She was arrested and then briefly released from jail to dissuade an angry crowd bent on freeing her. Another woman supporter, Fanny Sellins, was murdered in West Natoma. 76. The National Committee enrolled 100,000 unionists by June 1919. Workers rejected Gary's concession of overtime after 8 hours. One Italian helper put it succinctly when, after completing a 24-hour double shift and being told that steelworkers make pretty good money, he replied, "To helly with money. No can live." Mother Jones spoke for many immigrant workers whose wages did not reach the poverty line despite long shifts. If Gary wants to work 12 hours a day, let him go in the blooming mill and work. What we want is a little leisure, time for music, playgrounds, a decent home, books and the things that make life worthwhile. 77. Skilled American-born workers joined the unions in a second wave after the immigrants. The skilled men worked fewer hours than the unskilled, but few totaled less than 60 hours weekly. Grievances over speed-ups and promotion policies energized the skilled and semi-skilled operatives. The less skilled proved most loyal to the strike, but all groups shared what David Brody has called the terrible sense of betrayal brought about by peace without reform. Layoffs in early 1919 gave added force to shorter hours, share the work arguments. 78. Repression, in the form of firings of union leaders and refusal to bargain, heightened resistance. Corporate use of power and influence over local officials and clergymen provoked free speech fights and split immigrant workers from pro-company community leaders. As David Sapis wrote regarding immigrants and the 1919 events in the steel industry, for almost the first time the immigrant workers dared to defy the dominant element, the old leaders and newspapers, and followed the National Committee. 79. Rank and file commitment to unionism and shorter hours grew so fast that it changed the plans of the union strategists. Local leaders began to preach the possibility of the 6-hour day, though the National Committee had no such plans. On May 25, 1919, when 583 local union representatives met in Pittsburgh, they had to be reminded that only the international unions could call strikes. The delegates proposed an 8-hour day, or less. 80. On June 20, the National Committee wrote to Gary, spokesman for the steel industry, asking that he meet with the negotiations committee. No reply came, and 3 weeks later Foster warned, "Some action must be taken. Men are in a state of great unrest. Great strikes are threatening." The National Committee, though reluctant to move until 60% of the industry was unionized, soon authorized a strike vote. It carried with 98% of those polled voting to strike. Union recognition headed the list of demands, but below this were calls for an 8-hour day at an American wage, 1 day's rest in 7, and an end to 24-hour shifts. 81. When the union negotiators visited Gary on August 26, he refused to meet, citing the industry's open shop policy. Gompers, still nominal head of the National Committee, asked President Wilson to bring Gary to the bargaining table. The AFL president reported that Wilson thought Gary's intransigence misplaced, but Wilson made no public move. Wilson's emissary, Bernard Baruch, also failed to persuade Gary to bargain. The president ultimately followed Baruch's advice not to jeopardize ratification of the League of Nations Treaty by pushing Gary further. 82 Wilson did pressure the unions. On September 10, labor officials learned that he had requested that Gompers postpone the steel strike, set for September 22, until after the White House Industrial Conference, which was to convene on October 6. The heads of 7 participating unions stated their intention to defer striking, but Fitzpatrick, Foster, and most of local unionists involved saw delay as certain to lead to demoralization and to weak wildcat strikes. They stuck to the order. Stop. Work September 22, 83. Few union leaders and fewer executives envisioned a large strike. Foster was almost alone in appreciating that gang labor and group loyalty among immigrants could generate a mass strike with only a minority of the workers enrolled in unions. On September 22, as many as 275,000 struck. The strike peaked early the next week with about 365,000 strikers. Plants in Chicago, Wheeling, John Estown, Lackawanna, Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pueblo, Colorado, shut down. In the Pittsburgh area, the walkout was totally effective in Monessen and Donora, somewhat less so in Homestead, Braddock, and Bethlehem. It largely failed in Duquesne and in some Pittsburgh mills. Pig iron production dropped to less than 54% of normal output by October. 84. The steel corporations mounted a fierce counterattack. As Brody has observed, the hard-won fruits of the free speech fight were immediately cancelled. After brief rioting in Gary, precipitated by the importation of strikebreakers in early October, repression grew. In a few cities, labor did command sufficient political power to have its own men deputized to keep order, but in the key Pennsylvania centers, the strikers faced hostile local and state police and Company guards. The last group killed a child, a young mother, and several men at New Castle on the first day of the strike. As many as 22 steelworkers and their supporters were killed during the conflict. Labor spies dogged union activities and attempted to sow ethnic and racial discord. 85. The corporations suffered a disadvantage. As long as the 12-hour day and Gary's refusal to bargain constituted the main strike issues, public opinion would not support the Steel Trust. The solution was to use anti-immigrant and anti-radical propaganda to change the meaning of the strike. The sermon of a Catholic priest in Braddock, for example, became a widely broadcast anti-strike pamphlet, commended by Pennsylvania's governor. Part of it read, "This strike is not being brought about by intelligent or English-speaking workmen but by men who have not interest in the community, are not an element of our community. But you can't reason with these people. Don't reason with them. Knock them down." 86. The rhymes of popular, sentimental poet Edgar Guest drove the nativist, anti-radical themes home in a factory magazine. Said Dan McGann to a foreign man who worked at the selfsame bench, "Let me tell you this," and for emphasis, he flourished a monkey wrench, "Don't talk to me of this bourgeoisie, don't open your mouth to speak of your socialists or your anarchists, don't mention the Bolshevik, for I've had enough of this foreign stuff. I'm sick as a man can be, of the speech of hate, and I'm telling you straight, that this is the land for me." 87. When a reporter for the employer publication Iron Age rediscovered Foster's 1911 pamphlet Syndicalism, CO authored with Earl Ford, charges of communist influence on the strike came to focus on Foster's leadership. Though Foster appeared before a Senate committee to testify that he rejected some of his former ideas on syndicalism and on direct action, the committee found that, behind this strike is massed a considerable element of IWWs, anarchists, revolutionists and Russian Soviets. It recommended deportation of alien strikers. In the atmosphere of the Palmer raids and of the post-war drive for Americanism, by Vider Ann's groups, such red baiting nurtured a growing back-to-work movement among American-born, mostly skilled, workers. 88. Victimized by a press that consistently and prematurely proclaimed that work was returning to normal and unable to overcome the animus of as many as 30,000 black strikebreakers to unions that had practiced racial exclusion, the strike also suffered from poor cooperation by the AFL leadership. Gompers, who had opposed going ahead with the walkout, staked his hopes on pressuring Gary at the White House Industrial Conference, which began on October 6. Baruch, eyeing a possible détente between Gary and Gompers, added the former as a public spokesman at the last moment. Then, for the love of Mike, asked the UMWA Journal, who will represent the employers? 89 Gary flatly refused arbitration, and Gompers could not force him into discussion of the issues. The full conference, called to discuss broader matters, did not press Gary on the steel situation. After 2 weeks, Gompers walked out of the meetings in protest. 90. The AFL contributed little to the support of the strike. The 24 Partick iPadding unions pledged a strike fund of $100,000, but raised only $46,000. All other AFL unions added just $272,000, nearly a third of which came from the radical ILGWU and Furriers. The ACW, outside the AFL, was more generous than any union in it, giving $100,000. Even if all funds had been distributed, only $1.15 would have gone to each striker during the course of the 15-week strike. Moreover, the AFL unions often subordinated strike support to their craft interests. While significant rank-and-file unity developed, organizational differences remained. Federation proved to be an indecisive step toward industrial unionism. The Amalgamated Association sent its members who were under contract back to work during the walkout. The operating engineers broke with the strike leadership over jurisdictional matters. 91. By November 24, with the strike deteriorating, the National Committee saw arbitration as its last hope for partial success. Fitzpatrick sought intervention by the Interchurch World Movement. The IWM accepted his overture, though it insisted on acting not as an arbitrator, but as a mediator. Gary refused mediation, adding that there was absolutely no issue to discuss. When the strike officially ended, on January 8, 1920, production had already returned to normal in all major steel centers. The 12-hour shift was intact. The capitulation of the National Committee managed some bravado, announcing a return to work, pending preparations for the next big organization movement. But despite a flurry of activity in 1923, no such campaign would materialize until the 1930s. 92. After the defeat of the steel strike, most trade union action concerning the working day was defensive until the limited 5-day week campaigns of the late 1920s. Exceptions included the International Association of Firefighters, which led fights to gain the 8-hour day, primarily through legislation, in New York, Montana, and elsewhere during 1926 and 1927. These efforts bore fruit in the latter years when New York City instituted the 8-hour day for police and firefighters. 93 At least 2 unions tried to transcend the 8-hour standard in the mid-1920s. About 8,000 New England telephone operators, organized by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, struck for the 7-hour day in July 1923, and hundreds of Chicago soda clerks organized for the 7-hour day in 1926. But these movements were isolated and often episodic and came in the context of a general retreat among trade unions, a retreat characterized by great hesitancy to link shorter hours with workers' control. Progress in reducing the working day in the 1920s came as much through the efforts of reformers as through those of unions. Again, steel was pivotal, with the 12-hour day finally yielding to reformers. But in the absence of mass labor pressure, the reformers adopted increasingly conservative rationales for ending long hours and soon lost interest. The AFL came also to adopt those rationales, for the first time accepting the argument that working conditions and control over work should be traded for leisure. 95 Much of the ironic story of the failure of reformers to sustain shorter hours agitation, and the willingness of the AFL to abandon shorter hours as a demand tied to workers' control, is bound up with the beginnings of 5-day workweek campaigns and is described in a separate study. 96 Within the scope of this book, the 8-hour campaign among reformers in steel deserves attention, along with its antecedents and legacy. The Reform Coalition supporting a shorter workweek in the early 1920s included both religious humanitarians who pressed the fight against long hours largely by appealing to the concept of justice and who often supported labor unionism, and corporate engineering experts who emphasized productivity and profit. That the ideas of the corporate engineering group came to dominate the coalition speaks to the weakness of the post-1919 labor movement, both in numbers and in ideas, as a pole to attract humanitarian reformers. The religious reformers who participated in the 1919 to 1923 campaign against long hours in the steel industry were part of the longest tradition of protest over the working week in the United States. Spiritual opposition to Sunday labor long preceded the formation of trade unions. 97 After the Civil War, both 6-day week and 8-hour day activism among church leaders and laity existed as important minority trends. The Christian Labor Union, founded in 1872, functioned not as a union but as a religiously based shorter hours propaganda group in which Ira Stewart and George McNeil were central figures. From the 1880s through 1907, the Church Association for the Advancement of the Interests of Labor supported shorter hours, especially for women, children, and railroad workers, and campaigned for a Saturday half-holiday. By 1889, some of the religious press, including the Andover Review, the Christian Union, and the Independent, favored the 8-hour system. 98 Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical on the condition of labor recalled the obligation of the cessation from work and labor on Sundays and certain festivals, and added more generally that, in all agreements between masters and workpeople there is always the condition, expressed or understood, that there be allowed proper rest for soul and body. At the turn of the century, Gompers commented that the ministry was ceasing to be part of that host that prayed for us 1 minute on Sunday and prayed on us all the rest of the week, and was showing an interest in Sunday leisure. 99. In the early 20th century, socially concerned Protestant ministers representing a wide variety of denominations newly organized into the Federal Council of Churches, FCC, addressed the hours question in that group's 1908 social creed, drafted by the radical Methodist, the Rev. Harry F. Ward, and influenced by the Presbyterian minister, Charles Stelzl. The document resolved in favor of a release from employment 1 day in 7, and for the gradual and reasonable reduction of the hours of labor to the lowest practicable point. In 1910, an FCC committee investigated the Bethlehem steel strike and found long hours in steel unhealthy and unsocial, and a disgrace to civilization. It proposed a law requiring 3 daily shifts in all continuously operating industries. The government, it advised, should buy only steel made on a 48-hour-week basis. 100. Between 1910 and 1918, the FCC reaffirmed its commitment to the social creed, and Ward, heading the Methodist Federation for Social Service, developed a brilliant case for the shorter working day. Attuned to labor's critiques of the alienation engendered by scientific management, Ward argued for less hours as part of a broader strategy to reunite the task and the song. Concrete political stands, especially in 1916, in support of 8 hours for railway workers, accompanied his theorizing. Stelzl supported hours legislation and, as field secretary for the FCC, pressured the New York State Industrial Commission to act against the 12-hour day in the steel industry. 101. In many ways, the contributions of churches to the shorter hours movement were weak before World War I, however. The great body of churchmen were either aloof or opposed to reform. Both the historian Richard Ely, an advocate of the social gospel, and his associate John R. Commons complained in the late 19th century that even the issue of Sunday labor elicited only a small response from the ministry. Ely, for example, reported contact with one bakers' union leader seeking the clergy's support for a New York law against Sunday labor. The Unionists sent 500 circulars to New York City and Brooklyn ministers and received 6 replies. "You will have a hard time, Professor," he told Ely, "to convince the toilers of this country that the clergy will even do anything for them. There is no money in it, you know." 102. Many religious leaders held an abstract view of labor that had little application to the modern workplace and dissipated concern over the working day. Although early 20th century Catholic thinkers developed an anti-materialist critique of the alienating aspects of mass production, this critique coexisted with the papal view that work, since the fall of Adam, had to be alienating. "Cursed be the earth in thy work," Leo XIII quoted Genesis, adding that labor will have no end or cessation on this earth, for the consequences of sin are bitter. At the same time, and in seeming contradiction, some Catholic leaders idealized labor, with James Cardinal Gibbons seeing productive activity as the key to gladness, health and contentment, in contrast to the indolent life that breeds discontent, disease and death. This same view of labor as the source of virtue was prominent in Protestant thought and sometimes led to an evasion of the issues of the working day. 103. Such tendencies toward an abstract view of labor often led the churchmen to formulate their positions on the working day in terms having little relevance to concrete campaigns for the universal 8-hour day. Leo XIII's position that hours should vary, indeterminately, according to the job, age, sex, and even season, for example, could hardly become the object for agitation. Nor did the FCC's advocacy of gradual and reasonable reduction of hours carry a concrete thrust. 104. Finally, religious advocacy of shorter hours tended to strengthen the most conservative elements in the labor movement. Catholics and Protestants eyed each other's appeals to working-class Americans suspiciously and sought to build religiously based alliances with union leaders. Both groups blocked mainly with pure and simple craft unionists. The Catholics particularly found common cause with the Gompers' leadership, especially between 1910 and 1916, on the issue of anti-socialism and on a distrust of state action to reform social ills. The latter stance led to Catholic opposition to even child labor laws. This stance also dovetailed neatly with Gompers' insistence that workers would look upon shorter hours as injustice or hardship if the reforms were forced upon them by law. Protestant reformers joined the Catholics in castigating socialism, preaching class harmony, and supporting AFL conservatives. 105. Nonetheless, religious reformers were at times valuable allies for even the most militant shorter hours agitators. Ward showed how Christian concepts regarding the dignity of labor could be welded in a critique of long hours and capitalist efficiency. 106 Under certain circumstances, more conservative churchmen also inched toward support of industrial unionism and toward concrete proposals for a shorter workweek. The crisis years of World War I and the 1919 strike wave provided such circumstances. Protestant denominations articulated increasingly specific post-war reform agendas, which included the 8-hour day. The Committee on the War and Religious Outlook of the Episcopal Church refused to accept the need for continuous output as a justification for long days and 7-day weeks, writing, "It is only the setting of profit above personality that prevents adding more workers and shortening the workweek." 10 The most ambitious of the war-bred Protestant organizations, the IWM, played a leading part in shorter hours agitation. Taking shape in 1918 largely as an organization to raise funds for missionary work, the IWM had enlisted the support of 60 denominations by January 1919. By October 2, 1919, just after the steel strike had begun, the IWM had ready to confer ends on industrial relations, called at the request of AFL, congressional, and cabinet officials. The steel strike and conditions in the industry dominated the conference, which resolved for a thoroughgoing investigation of the strikes in steel. 108 A 9-person committee of the IWM investigated the conflict from the third week of the steel strike until a month after its end. Its members' views ranged from those of its chairperson, Methodist Bishop Francis McConnell, a left liberal supporter of independent labor politics, to the apolitical fundamentalism of the Presbyterian drive. John McDowell and generally betrayed little sympathy for radical unionism. However, the staff investigators included David Sappas, Eber Blankenholm, and George Soule, all among the greatest modem experts on labor and all then inclined toward socialism. 109. The IWM report, released to the press on July 28, 1920, was a pro-labor document of the highest order. Along with the subsequent companion volume, Public Opinion in the Steel Strike, it squarely took the union's side, scoring the 12-hour day, low wages, and Gary's refusal to bargain. The report castigated the complicity of local, state, and federal authorities in violating free speech for labor organizations. It consistently emphasized the working day as an issue and ridiculed the notion that the strike had been a Bolshevik plot. Few strikers, it maintained, could put together 2 sentences on Soviets, but almost all cursed. Long hours, zero. Americanization, the report continued, is a farce. Night schools are worthless, Carnegie libraries are a jest, churches and welfare institutions are ironic, while the steelworker is held to the 12-hour day. Not only has he no energy left, he has literally no time. 111 A separate study by the Federal Council of Churches reinforced the same point. 2. The investigators wrote as witnesses to an unprecedented organizing feat and to a series of events in which the steel strike, as Mary Hedenvorse put it, bled to death like a living thing. Their report displayed a frank admiration for the possibilities of amalgamated trade unionism. When the report discussed an efficiency, it did so in the context of destroying the petty tyrannies of management and of expanding rank and file control of the production process. Although opposed to the closed shop, the investigators saw unions as central to reform and predicted that another strike must come. 3. The report speedily went through 5 printings, secured nearly a score of laudatory mentions in religious publications, and became the subject of hundreds of articles and editorials in the broader press, over 75% of which the IWM termed favorable. European papers carried digests of the investigation, and the city government of Glasgow, Scotland, for a time held up a large order of steel rails to protest labor conditions in the American industry. Labor papers embraced the document and purchased it in large quantities. 114. We might measure the broad acceptance of the report by the ambitious attempts of the steel corporations to discredit it. Iron Age denounced the document as the work of radicals. Pamphlets by F. M. Barton and the Rev. E. Victor Bigelow criticized the report and enjoyed wide distribution by U.S. Steel. Marshall Olds's huge analysis of the IWM report on the steel strike, a wildly anti-Bolshevik tract, also drew corporation backing. 5 members of the National Civic Federation and National Association of Manufacturers withdrew support from the IWM, sending its available funding down to 15% of its former level by 1921. By the time of the 1923 reform campaign in the steel industry, the Industrial Relations Department of the IWM had disbanded. In the 1923 events, more moderate religious forces would register their protests against long hours and register them in softer tones easily drowned out by those of a growing contingent of corporate reformers. 116. The reformers who approached the working day from the standpoint of efficiency and profit, like their religious counterparts, had a long tradition of activity around the hours issue. That tradition was also transformed during the war years into a new set of arguments advanced with more force and urgency. Since the mid-19th century, a small minority of workshop and factory owners and managers had maintained that shorter hours did not necessarily lead to a decrease in production. Basing themselves on the experiences of individual firms, these capitalist reformers pointed to the payoffs in goodwill, workers' health, longevity of machine performance, and quality of work engendered by a shorter working day. A few, following George Gunton, connected less hours to increased markets and to technological innovations. Others saw 8 hours as a way to diffuse labor protest. 117. During the pre-war progressive era, the strongest non-religious reform arguments for reductions in hours linked national efficiency with corporate interests. Mixing biological and mechanical metaphors, progressives considered conservation of humanity to require the construction of society as the perfect machine. When, according to one theorist of conservation, mankind shall have learned to apply the common sense and scientific rules of efficiency to the care of body and mind and to the labors of body and mind, the nation would be nearing the condition of perfect. 118. Such a view of shorter hours as productive of both industrial and social efficiency characterized the writings of the main pre-war group attacking long hours. The steel industry reformers centered around Survey magazine and the Cabot Fund. John Fitch and Paul Kellogg, Fitch's supervising editor on the massive 1907-1908 sociological study known as the Pittsburgh Survey, identified the 12-hour day as a source of social problems in the steel industry. From the start, they cooperated in their attacks on long hours with steel company officials and stockholders. William Brown Dixon, a U.S. Steel vice president who had risen through the ranks and recalled the 12-hour day and 7-day weeks as twin relics of barbarism, had attacked the long-hour system as inefficient and socially destructive as early as 1907. Charles Cabot, a minority stockholder, joined Dixon in his calls for reduction of hours shortly thereafter, and the two pressed the issue at stockholders' meetings. 9. Dixon and Cabot emphasized that the long day meant inefficiency and that financial returns could survive reform. Fitch, especially in his much-quoted 1911 article, Old Age at 40, stressed social costs. Louis Brandeis's testimony before a House committee just after Fitch's article was published distilled Fitch's points. The steelworker was a useless individual and a burden to his family at 40. And transmitted, perhaps through many generations, the evil weaknesses and the degeneration which have come to him. In 1911, the Reform Coalition succeeded in establishing a committee, initiated by the U.S. Steel stockholders, to investigate Fitch's charges. When that committee returned its findings the following year, it allowed that the prevailing shifts led to a decreasing of the efficiency and lessening of the vigor and virility of workers. 120. However, reform arguments regarding the physiological and psychological benefits of the shorter days suffered from their failure to mesh well with scientific management. Although Frederick W. Taylor and other scientific managers held out the possibility of reducing hours to provide incentive to workers, in practice they much more often used short-term pay differentials. Taylor's ideal of a high-priced man translated easily into managerial practice regarding wages. Cuts in hours, on the other hand, would have had to influence whole departments, pro-ducking the kind of group feeling which was anathema to Taylor. Moreover, Taylor had little concern with psychology or physiology, basing his studies mainly on mechanics. Taylorism thus undercut the older rationales for securing cooperation from a healthy, happy workforce through reduction in hours. The Standard Guidebook of the Taylorists, published in 1911, featured a daily time clock, calibrated to the hundredth of an hour. It was a 10-hour clock. 121. Reformers wishing to draw on Taylorism to argue for shorter hours had to make a largely negative case. Brandeis, Goldmark, and Frankfurter, in their legal documentation for statutes regulating the hours of women's labor, did hold that Taylorism lay the groundwork for shorter hours, but they stressed not so much the leisure-creating possibilities of scientifically managed productivity as the alienating aspects of newly designed jobs. Embracing both scientific management and reduced hours, they portrayed the latter as antidote for the former. 122. After 1915, and especially during and just after World War I, many of the impediments to the development of an efficiency-based, profit-oriented reform argument for a shorter working day dropped away. With Taylor's death in 1915, the work reform movement, building on his basic framework of skilled labor, began to devote more attention to the problem of motivation through psychological incentives. 123. The post-1915 management experts also emphasized physiology more than Taylor had. Crucially, the new breed of efficiency experts followed Ford in seeing not just systematic loafing but also turnover and absenteeism as key management problems, and in believing that these problems required a welfare capitalist strategy not hinging on wage incentives. 124. The coming of the war and the institution of prohibition after the war helped to solidify the trend toward a welfare capitalist management style, which could coherently attack very long working days. War production elevated the attack on waste of human resources into a national duty. The War Labor Board encouraged labor management cooperation, often by granting shorter days to unions and concessions on implementing scientific management to employers. Such actions cemented the AFL's making of peace with a wing of the scientific management movement and culminated in Gompers's work with Morris Cook on the 1920 treatise, Labor, Management and Productivity, a systematic defense of labor, scientific management détente. 125 Prohibition, which seemed to many executives a tremendous boon to productivity, also helped disarm the 19th century objection that shorter hours led to debauchery. 126. By 1920 John R. Commons and John B. Andrews could write, of the many lessons which the World War taught industry, none is more clear-cut than that long hours do not pay. 127 In addition, they could be certain that management experts and reformers would understand their point on several different levels. They could point out that in a number of wartime studies of specific industries, shorter hours had proven compatible with maintained production levels in at least some of the factories surveyed. 28 Moreover, studies emphasized that for much of the day, workers were resting or waiting for work and that increased actual work time was therefore possible within shorter shifts. Finally, the celebrated post-war waste in industry report, prepared under the direction of Herbert Hoover, so overwhelmingly concentrated on inefficiency among managers that small changes in production resulting from reductions in hours paled by comparison. 129. Other reform arguments stressed that a third of the 2.5 million men examined for Army service were rejected as physically unfit by pointing out that a long day did not pay in terms of national health. With both social well-being and productive efficiency at stake, experts considered whether long hours contributed to occupational disease. Although some early studies held out little prospect that adjusting hours fostered health or decreased accidents, by 1924 a growing body of literature linked shorter hours with decreased absenteeism due to illness or disability and enabled the economist P. Sargent Florence to argue that about 1/4 of the 8-hour difference between a 52-hour and a 60-hour working week was simply given back in increased lost time due to sickness. 130. Others emphasized that disputes at work resulted from tiredness. One management expert who worked in steel mills in order to observe them held, if it is true, that 98% of the disputes they were asked to solve simmered down finally to some petty dispute between a foreman and a man, then I am willing to wager that the majority of these 98% came when both the foreman and worker were just plain tired. U.S. Public Health Service researches suggested that the adoption of an 8-hour day might significantly decrease tardiness among workers. 131 Long hours were inefficient, Whiting-Williams wrote, because men are paid for energies which they simply are not able to deliver. It remained for the crusading department store owner, Edward Filene, to add that management ought not apologize for alienating jobs, but hold out increased consumption and the eventual possibility of a 5-hour day as compensation. 132. By 1920 such efficiency-based reasons for a shorter day produced a strong case against very long working days. The steel industry, the storm center in 1919 and the bastion of an 84-hour week, naturally became the object of the reformers' attention. That industry's many unemployed workers gave force to the argument that shorter hours could be part of a voluntary business Labourgouvernement plan to ease joblessness. The 1921 President's Conference on Unemployment, organized by Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, advised such work sharing as well as regulation of hours to rationalize seasonal industries, at the very time that critics of the steel industry pointed to its unwillingness to abandon the 12-hour day in order to create jobs. 133 Indeed, Hoover, bringing together and towering over the other corporate reformers, became the central figure in the campaign against the long day in steel. 134. With labor action against the steel industry stalled, humanitarian reformers who had mixed religious appeals, support for unions, and efficiency arguments increasingly concentrated on the last. Survey magazine allowed that the AFL was unlikely to change conditions in the industry soon and added, the employers are in full possession of the power to bring about reform. Losing confidence in labor pressure, surveys sometimes still stressed the role of public opinion, but most often reported on the professional opinion of engineers. Even Fitch's freewheeling and humane attacks on long hours, which drew here on religion, there on social uplift, gave way, in surveys pages, to narrower descriptions of how an 8-hour day might enhance productive efficiency. 135. Paul Kellogg, the reform editor who in 1920 persuaded his fellow Cabot Fund trustees to reopen the hours issue in steel, opted for an efficiency engineering approach. The Cabot Fund commissioned Morris Cook, the Taylor follower instrumental in bringing the AFL into cooperation with scientific management, to study the economic feasibility of a transition to 8 hours. Cook, working with Horace Drury of the American Engineering Council, studied a score of U.S. steel plants already working under a 3-shift system, and found no outstanding obstacle to adoption of that system. The Cook-Drury study, published by the Taylor Society, predicted that as little as a 3% rise in costs would accompany the transition. A Cook report even found a dairy farm more profitably run under the 8-hour system and concluded, if the cow seems able to adapt herself, it ought not be hard for some others to make the change. reformers, emphasizing that the three-shift system was one which, practically every steel production center in the world, excepting the United States, has universally introduced, also drew on studies from abroad to show that managerial improvements could enable employees to earn more in 8 hours than they previously had in 136. Kellogg moved to commit the Cabot Fund to further action but met resistance from other trustees. Only after giving assurances that fund contributions would not be used not to undertake a publicity campaign against the steel industry but only to mobilize internal pressure, did Kellogg's designated leader for the new campaign, Columbia professor Samuel McCune Lindsay, secure necessary funding. Lindsay, a prominent Republican with ties to Hoover and to President Warren G. Harding, found in the former an especially strong ally. As president of the Federated American Engineering Societies, Hoover had initiated studies that he felt showed the long day to be barbaric and uneconomic. By early 1922, cooperating with Lindsay, he initiated a Commerce Department investigation as well. Hoover wanted quick progress because he thought that high stakes were involved. Reform would forestall the spread of radical unionism, he maintained, and would give the steel industry credit for some kind of initiative instead of waiting until they are smashed into by some kind of legislation. 137. Taking heart from Gary's 1921 statements that the 12-hour day would end in the comparatively near future, Hoover delayed asking public action of Harding until after the April 17, 1922, annual meeting of U.S. Steel in hopes that Gary might sound the death knell of the long day at that meeting. Hoover did present his findings on the question to Harding on April 8 and induced the president to send Gary a letter designed to stir his imagination, just before the meeting. Release of the report of the American Engineering Council's Committee on Work Periods in Continuous Industry and the announcement of a new study on steel by that group also were timed to pressure Gary. The strategy failed when Gary not only failed to commit himself to reform but repeated his 1921 statement laying blame for the long day on the desire of the workers to be paid for 12 hours and adding that the work was usually not laborious and not injurious. Gary also cited the impossibility of finding enough labor, with the closing of immigration, if 8 hours were adopted. 138. Hoover, with rare passion, persuaded Harding to call a May 18 meeting of 41 steel executives at the White House. At the meeting the Commerce Secretary denounced long hours in terms Gary found unsocial and uneconomic. Harding persuaded the group to investigate the working day. Gary, who praised the president because he did not insist unduly on reform, was made head of the investigating committee. Hoover, in less than a good humor, left the dinner to tell reporters that Harding was trying to persuade the steel industry to adopt the 8-hour shift. 139. No action came from the steel corporations through the succeeding 6 months. Hoover and Secretary of Labor James J. Davis meanwhile pressed for administration support for 8 hours. With Gary a leading financial backer of Republican candidates, the president hesitated to act, but political considerations made him slowly move against the 12-hour day. By November 1922, when the Federated American Engineering Society issued its The 12-Hour Shift in Industry, Harding agreed to sign an introduction praising the study. The president, in words likely drafted by Hoover, endorsed the idea that the old order of the 12-hour day must give way to a better and wiser system. 140. Even as Hoover and Lindsay engineered pressure from corporate leaders inside and outside the steel industry, Gary stood his ground and delayed reporting on his much-promised study. When, on May 25, 1923, the Gary Committee did release the results of its study, they justified continuing long hours on every count. The workers wanted long shifts, the schedule did little or no harm, the SYSTEM was a productive one, and change would add 15% to costs. 141. Hoover attacked the Gary report in a letter asking Harding not to allow this matter of fundamental social importance to drop. By June 13 he wrote not just to Harding but for him, drafting a letter to Gary, which the president signed. Reiterating engineering reports and making humanitarian arguments, the letter cornered the steel leader by asking that he admit that long hours were destructive and pledged to ameliorate them when recessions cut the demand for labor in steel. With even the conservative New York Times implying that it would welcome legislative action on the issues and with bodies representing America's Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant clergy aroused, Gary capitulated at last. On June 27 he wired Harding that the 8-hour day would be established at the earliest practicable time, and appended a personal note inviting Harding to make the announcement. Harding chose an Independence Day speech to tell Americans that tens of thousands of steel workers could look forward to as many as 36 more hours of freedom weekly. His ringing remarks, again penned by Hoover, discouraged tendencies toward delay. By August major mills in Gary, Pittsburgh, and Chicago were on the new schedule. Wage boosts of 25% gave back some of the lost pay. A moderate 5% boost in costs of steelmaking was far offset by other factors, and the months after the reform proved profitable for the steel industry. 142. At the time of the reform, both Union and Communist papers predicted that Gary would again evade implementation by making use of vague language. Gompers advised all not to expect too much. The Worker warned of the 8-hour hoax of U.S. Steel. As late as 1930, New Republic documented continuing 12-hour days in steel. 143 nonetheless. Average weekly hours in the industry plummeted from 63.2 in 1922 to 54.4 in 1926. Reform had come, despite relative absence of immediate union pressure. Indeed, between 1921 and 1923, the impetus for reform came largely from those with close ties to corporate capitalism. With the steel reform underway, the question became whether or not the Reform Coalition would push for further reductions of hours in other industries. 144. The question of whether such corporate reform could be harnessed to management-labor cooperation was especially vital to William Greene and the embattled leadership of the AFL. As one historian has put it, with the relationship between scientific management and labor blossoming into a love affair, at least on labor's side, Greene hoped to deliver what trade union radicals promised: a 40-hour week. 145. The idea of cutting the workweek by cutting the days of labor had its earliest origins in Sabbatarianism and, more recently, in the Saturday half-holiday campaigns begun in the late 19th century and the actual scattered achievement of the 5-day week as early as 1908.146. But the goal remained a dream for the overwhelming majority of U.S. workers, and Greene gave it a new twist. Rather than packaging the shorter workweek as a control demand to be won along with other workplace issues, he came to argue that the 5-day week was compensation for acceptance of alienating labor. When the AFL went on record as favoring the 5-day week at its October 1926 convention, Greene's logic found echoes in those of many delegates and overshadowed older arguments stressing health, happiness, citizenship, and control. 147. In 1925, Greene had led the AFL in proposing a social wage tied to productivity and given in exchange for union cooperation on work rules. 148. The 5-day week was, as labor pointed out at the time, an extension of the same logic. 149. In the 1926 debate on the workweek, Greene made it clear that labor must accept not only machinery, as the unions long had, but also increasingly alienating relations of production. We would not go back to the old times if we could, but we are adjusting ourselves to the new, and as we look upon a modem factory with its mass production, with its specialization and with its standardization, we realize that we must point the way by which we can adjust ourselves to this new industrial order. That adjustment, he added, hinged on increased wages and increased leisure for recuperation and readjustment. 150. Other delegates reinforced this point. John Frey held that the new educational campaign was not a continuation of old AFL work around the issue but a new departure based on increased per capita production. James Lynch specifically added that he did not believe that Henry Ford himself could eliminate these processes that have grown up, the continuous performance by the individual of the same task. But, he continued, the committee has indicated the remedy for the fatigue and atrophy that follows the repetitive processes in industry by proposing a shorter week. 151. Such logic ensured that the AFL would have to redouble efforts to eliminate radical influences in the unions. Thus, it is not quite so paradoxical as it might seem that one of Greene's first actions after the passing of 5-day resolution was to attempt to purge the leadership of the Furriers Union in New York, where a long strike had just won what the historian Bert Cochran has called a spectacular left-wing victory. The first 40-hour, 5-day week in the garment industry. Under Ben Gold, the New York Furriers leadership was largely communist and therefore seemed less a model of 5-day effectiveness than a threat to AFL leaders. 152. A more abiding paradox lies in the fact that the AFL's 5-day proclamation came in the same month that one of Modem America's staunchest anti-unionists announced the institution of the 5-day week for all but a few of the workers in his huge enterprise. Ford, eyeing increased consumption and more production from man and machine, towered over all other corporate officials in systematizing the rationale for a 5-day week and in actually providing workers with the new schedule. The 270 companies identified by the National Industrial Conference Board as having the 5-day week in 1928 employed just over 218,000 workers. 80% of them worked for just one firm, Ford. Fuller figures estimated that 400,000 wage earners had a 5-day week. Over 40% of them were Ford workers. 153. The very proximity of Ford's October announcement and the AFL's 5-day resolution ensured that Ford and William Greene's arguments would be mentioned together frequently. Some AFL leaders welcomed the comparison. But militant unionists and pro-union reformers like the young minister Reinhold Niebuhr had to balance Ford's open shop position, speed-ups, and institution of pay cuts, estimated by the Christian Century at $4 to $6 per week, against his 5-day week position. Some pointed out that since Ford boasted that output in 5 days could equal that of the longer week, the reform was in effect a speed-up paid for by lost wages among the workers. Although the labor press sometimes reported on Ford sympathetically, he was far from a perfect ally. Indeed, Ford's 5-day week received scathing indictment as bunk, a favorite Ford word, in several labor papers, although his rationale for reform differed little from that of the AFL leadership. 154. More importantly, even with the arguments developed before and during the shorter hours campaign in steel and with the opportunity afforded to management to lead and co-opt further a compliant labor movement, the AFL Fordist initiative regarding a 5-day week was simply a failure in the 1920s. Only a relative handful of managerial experts, and still fewer employers, embraced either the 5-day week or working days of below 8 hours. Indeed, once the steel reform had been partially implemented, the urgency of attacking even very long hours diminished. Hoover, who later contended his actions in the steel campaign rid all American workers of the 12-hour and even the 10-hour day, joined most other corporate reformers in ignoring the continued existence of such long days, sometimes combined with 7-day weeks, through the 1920s. The oil industry, railroad telegraphy, and rubber manufacturing were especially notorious on these scores. Some occupations appear to have witnessed attempts to lengthen the week to 7 days during the decade. 155 In the climate of reform through voluntary business-government association, even legislation providing a day's rest in 7 made only slow headway. 156 The very success of the steel drive, with its plethora of specific productivity-oriented research reports in its lat-tear stages, may have led to later inaction, both by producing an example which suggested legislation was superfluous and by making reformers hesitant to act in other industries in which comparable studies had not been prepared. The reform activities had produced precious little to motivate employers to lower hours below the long-sought ideal of 48 per week. Sober perusal of the NICB studies, for example, would have revealed that, for all their considerable animus against long hours, they consistently opposed even reductions in hours to 48 weekly, finding efficiency best served at just above that standard. 157. Moreover, among humanitarian reformers formerly allied with the shorter hours movement, divisions in the mid-1920s led to weakness. This was true of feminists who split over the issue of whether or not to emphasize protective legislation, including maximum hours laws, or to stress passage of an equal rights amendment, which called the logic of special protection into question. 158 The child labor movement likewise split over whether to continue to push for a federal amendment or to opt for limited statewide campaigns. 159 Large corporations almost universally opposed the 5-day week during the 1920s. Through 1927, according to NICB statistics, only 3 other corporations employing over 2,000 had followed Henry Ford's lead in establishing the shorter schedule. Elbert Gary, representing U.S. Steel, found the 5-day system deplorable on every count and repeated as evidence against it the biblical injunction his company had until so recently defied by requiring Sunday work. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. Westinghouse's president censured Ford in strong terms which he felt express, ed. the view of practically every manufacturer and employer in this country. 160. Smaller manufacturers and employer associations likewise decried concessions on the workweek. John Edgerton, head of the National Association of Manufacturers and president of a Tennessee woolen mill, proclaimed it time for America to awake from its dream of an eternal holiday, and linked extra leisure with dissipation. Particularly feared was union imposition of the shorter week. 1. Buffalo bronze casting manufacturer found the AFL idea that production could be maintained during a 5-day week to be unadulterated bunk, predicting that no union man would exert himself 1 iota more per hour. NAM's 1926 article, The 5-Day Workweek, Can It Become Universal?, answered its title's question with a resounding, it will not. Iron Age, Bulletin of the National Association of Building Trades Employers, Commerce and Finance. Tithely as did the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. 161. In contrast to the situation prevailing during the campaign against the long day in steel, even those companies which had adopted the 5-day week often did not speak enthusiastically on its behalf. The New York World's mid-decade study of the 5-day week in stores in 14 large cities where Saturday closings had been adopted revealed wide divisions of opinion as to the efficiency of the system. Some mercantile leaders objected that the closings kept workers from shopping, but no sentiment for extending the system to industry found. 162 expression. Similar early studies of 5-day industrial concerns found almost an even split between satisfied employers and those upset by the results. Those factories keeping hours of more than 40 per week, but spreading them over 5 days, were happiest with the system. An ambitious NICB study, published in 1929, found greater approval for the 5-day week among the 270 plants it surveyed, but over half those plants worked greater than 40-hour schedules. Of those plants reducing hours, 6.4% reported substantially less production and 25.4% saw no increase in per-hour output under the 5-day format. 163. Nor did many efficiency, management, economics, or engineering experts embrace the 5-day week in the 1920s. The AFL, though anxious to show the reform as part of a strategy to increase production and consumption, could cite only a handful of experts who directly supported its theories. 164 AFL President William Green so cast about for corporate reform supporters that he strained the facts with a 1926 claim that Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon supported the 5-day week, when Mellon did so only to the extent that he commented, "If a man can accomplish his work in 5 days, there is no reason why he should work 6 days. 165 Labor Age and other magazines of the socialist labor movement often published articles by efficiency engineers, most of whom only Jenner ally criticized the waste associated with long days and others of whom eschewed specifics concerning what schedule should apply by asking, is a shorter workday enough? The American Labor Legislation Review greeted the call for a 5-day week with lukewarm interest, using it as an occasion to call for abolition of the 7-day week. The Society of Industrial Engineers published criticisms of the reform. 166 Those rare employers who supported the 5-day week usually engaged in the production or sale of consumer goods or services. Richard Feiss, whose 1920 article recounted the positive impact of a 5-day system, pointed to increased productivity, less turnover, especially among women workers whom his firm more easily attracted, and a speeding up of the slower workers. Feiss, a Clevelander, manufactured clothing in a non-union shop. Edward Filene, who saw the shorter week as part of a plan to Fordize America, was among the nation's largest department store owners. 167 W. Burke Harmon, a leading New York realtor, welcomed the 5-day week as likely to spur home ownership. The National Amusement Parks Association listened to descriptions of the reform with lively interest. 168. Just as few employers followed Ford to voluntary concessions regarding the 5-day week, few unions secured that goal through bargaining. At its 1928 convention, the AFL boasted of about 165,000 members working 5-day, 40-hour weeks. While this represented an increase of about 75,000 since 1926, about 70% of the total came from just 5 extremely well-organized building trades unions. The Painters Union alone furnished 38% of the total, with bricklayers, carpenters, electrical workers, and plasterers accounting together for about 1 unionized 5-day worker in 3. At least a fifth of those unionists benefiting from the reform, and perhaps nearly 30%, came from communist-influenced unions in the fur and clothing industries. 169 Conservative AFL leaders could hardly take much comfort from these figures, nor from the fact that more manufacturing establishments adopted the new system in the year before AFL agitation began than in the year after. 170 Nonetheless, the AFL leadership maintained that steady progress was being made and held out hope that public demand would bring the 5-day week. 171. Even in the building trades, the adoption of the 5-day system came slowly, outside of the Painters Union, before 1929. During that year, the number of 5-day building tradesmen more than doubled in a single stroke when the Building Trades Employers Association of New York granted the reform for 125,000 to 150,000 workers. 172 That action came despite the fact that most of the unions involved had earlier agreed not to bargain over the working week until 1930. However, the reform leadership of the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers won the 5-day week and a 10% pay hike effective February 1, 1929. Other building trades responded by seeking the same schedule, citing language in their contracts, stipulating that basic improvements won by any other trade in the industry would apply. 173 The New York Building Trades Council won the new system on May 4 and, in late May, defended it from an employer attempt to break up craft solidarity by locking out those unionists who refused to work with non-union electricians. The reform quickly spread to Chicago, St. Louis, and other cities. 174 But the brief contagion of 5-day fever in the building trades in 1929 did not signal a further spread until the deepening depression made easily justifiable share the work plans lively issues. In the 1920s, the shorter week initiative of the AFL leadership and of Ford failed. Its greatest shortcoming was that it presumed the existence of corporate reform support, which simply did not exist. Its weaknesses included a continuing AFL commitment to voluntarism, which made the organization disdain legislation on the working week even as its leaders spoke of the power of public demand. Throughout the decade, labor lobbying for federal hours legislation remained confined to laws extending a 44-hour week to more government employees and remained unsuccessful. 175 The fact that many workers, including some unionists, had not approached even the 48-hour week and that some still worked 7 days, also complicated the agitation. This forced the AFL to defend the 6-day week at 8 hours daily instead of the 40-hour week. 76 Many unions ignored the 5-day week call. Even the machinists, considered prominent in 5-day agitation, continued throughout 1928 to print preambles in their journal calling for a 44-hour week with a Saturday, Z's, holiday. 177 At least one union leader, George L. Barry of the Pressmen, openly opposed the 5-day week in the name of promoting the spirit of cooperation, with employers. 178. In the period from 1906 to 1919, when strikes and labor protest carried forward the movement for shorter hours and when the demand came in tandem with attacks on Taylorism, the workweek in non-agricultural industries fell by an average of 7.0 hours. In the decade thereafter, with Fordist ideas in full flower in an ideal setting of prosperity and with little labor opposition to a partially Fordized Taylorism, the workweek fell by just 1.3 hours, a figure buoyed mainly by Ford's 1926 reforms, the attack on the 12-hour day in steel, left-wing union campaigns, and some 1919 settlements born of militant organizing and strikes. 179. The AFL Fordist initiative for a 5-day week was virtually stillborn. If the new unionism had suffered critical defeats in its efforts to link hours, control, and militant labor action in 1919, so too had conservative AFL efforts to disentangle the workweek and control issues during the 1920s. The Great Depression, the New Deal, and shorter hours. In 1929, writes Irving Bernstein, the hours of work in American industry were long. Only 19% of the wage earners in manufacturing were scheduled for fewer than 48 hours per week, 26.5% were at 48, 31.1% were scheduled between 49 and 54, 15% between 55 and 59, and 7.4% worked a schedule of 60 hours or longer. At this time, by way of contrast, virtually all the industrialized nations of Europe and Australia enjoyed the 8-hour day, while the Soviet Union had introduced the 7-hour principle. In this regard, the United States lagged behind every other industrialized nation in the world. A shortening of the workweek in American industry was to be expected, according to Bernstein, even if there had been no depression. Unemployment added a note of urgency. 1. While unemployment statistics during the Great Depression were inadequate, we can chart the disaster on the basis of what we do have. 2. In October 1929, fewer than 1 million people were out of work. In January 1930, the unemployment figure passed 4 million. It reached 9 million in October 1931 and passed 10 million in December. The number of jobless went over 11 million in January 1932, crossed 12 million in March, and surpassed 13 million in June. In January 1933, there were more than 14 million persons out of work. The bottom was reached in March 1933 to 15,071,000 were unemployed. Moreover, immense numbers of employed persons were on short time. 3. The seriousness of the situation was not at first appreciated. In the months following the financial crash, both business and labor leaders urged a policy of patience, concurring in the belief that the depression would be short. Just as President Hoover and the leaders of big business believed that the stock market crash was merely a temporary decline, so the leadership of the AFL was convinced that, within a few months, industrial conditions will become normal, confidence and stability in industry and finance will be restored, and labor, strong and aggressive, will be prepared to demand and secure higher wages and greater degree of leisure. In the meantime, it was imperative that no movement beyond that already in negotiations should be initiated for increase of wages, and every cooperation should be given by labor to industry in the handling of its 243 problems. 4. In November 1929, the AFL leadership had already promised President Hoover, who had exacted a pledge from business tycoons to maintain the 1929 wage levels, that it would not seek wage increases nor strike during the economic crisis. At the 1930 convention, the AFL Executive Council reported that the AFL-IATES were cooperating by not raising issues that might embarrass or interrupt efforts to turn the tide upward. Such inaction proved futile either to overcome business stagnation, prevent wage cuts and the lengthening of working hours, or to stem the rising tide of unemployment. 5. Meanwhile, early in the Great Depression, the Communist Party and the newly formed Trade Union Unity League began to organize the jobless into groups known as unemployed councils. Under the slogan, "Starve or Fight," the unemployed councils issued calls for nationwide demonstrations for passage of an unemployment insurance bill, an end to evictions, improved relief in cash and in kind, state and federal aid, a 7-hour day and a 5-day week, with a 6-hour day for harmful and strenuous occupations, without reduction in pay. 6. Until 1932, the AFL refused even to consider the demand for passage of an unemployment insurance bill, labeling it as the dole, but it was ready to raise the demand for shorter hours as its sole plan to increase employment. The advocates of shorter hours in the labor movement reasoned that the depression had been caused by the rate of technological advance, which exceeded that of either wage increases or hours reduction. The inevitable result was technological unemployment, the displacement of workers by machines. The solution was to cut the hours of work with no loss in earnings, thereby increasing the number of jobs. This would lead to expanding purchasing power and the recovery of the system. 7. The Railway Employees Department of the AFL, representing the non-operating crafts, advocated a 40-hour week as the solution to joblessness as early as March 1930. In November, the train service brotherhoods began a drive for the 6-hour day while the AFL Metal Trades Department endorsed the 5-hour day. 8. The demand for shorter hours dominated the AFL convention in Boston in October 1930. Even the metal trades' radical proposal for the 5-hour day was given a hearing before the convention voted to refer it to the Executive Council for immediate and thorough consideration. However, most of the discussion centered around the 5-day week. "We have arrived at the period in our history of our nation and our industrial progress," declared President William Greene, "when the institution of the 5-day week in all industries out of the service industries should be immediately inaugurated." 9. The demand for the 5-day week also loomed large in the labor press in the months following the convention. Special attention was paid to the statement of Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers that the universal adoption of the 5-day week would put all of the unemployed to work. 10. But apart from John J. Raskob, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who had made his wealth in General Motors, few members of the capitalist class endorsed the call for a 5-day week. To be sure, the government printing office instituted the 5-day week, and the Snow Baking Powder Company went on 5 days. But these were exceptions. A Bureau of Labor Statistics survey in 1932 revealed that only 5.4% of 44,025 establishments had adopted the 5-day week for all or some of their employees. The unions lacked strength to enforce the demand for shorter hours. The idea of strikes for shorter hours was judged to be hopeless. But at a meeting of 3,500 fur workers on June 17, 1931, union leader Ben Gold rejected the argument that the crisis made it impossible to obtain higher wages and shorter hours. "This is a boss's theory," he cried, "which the agents of the bosses use in order to beat the workers into submission, into forcing them to accept hunger wages and conditions of slavery." The fur workers proved Gold correct by winning strikes for the 40-hour, 5-day week along with wage increases. 12. But the AFL leadership took no heed and intensified its efforts to destroy the left-wing fur workers' leadership. 13. During the early years of the Great Depression, Greene was an advocate of the practice of sharing work as a means of reducing unemployment. The principle of relating the number needing jobs to the total number of man-hours of work available should be permanently incorporated in national policy and business procedure. 14. By the summer of 1932, work sharing was receiving such enthusiastic support among employers that the movement crystallized into a national enterprise, and a Share the Work Committee was appointed by President Hoover with Walter C. Teagle, president of J.C. Standard Oil, as its chairman and William Greene an enthusiastic supporter. 15. Greene, however, did not represent the dominant response to work sharing in the labor movement. To be sure, a few unions, especially in the needle and printing trades, did adopt work sharing. But most unions opposed the idea. They pointed out that work sharing was quite different from a reduction in working hours. The consequence of spreading the shrinking number of actual working hours over a larger number of people with no advance in the hourly wage rates was lower earnings for the employed. Moreover, with most workers already at the subsistence level, work sharing could not increase jobs because it did not increase purchasing power. Work sharing, declared President A. F. Whitney of the Railroad Trainmen, is a device which tends to remove the burden of charity from the backs of the rich by giving all workers a wage which will barely remove the need for charitable assistance. 16. Whitney explained the support for Share the Work by some labor leaders as a result of their naive belief that this plan is a bona fide movement toward permanent shorter work hours, with the ultimate increased hourly rates of pay. But he noted that Share the Work had won support among many employers and the endorsement of the National Association of Manufacturers because it reduced incomes for workers, enabling employers to get the same work done at a lower cost. 17. The AFL Executive Council, meeting in Atlantic City on July 20, 1932, issued a statement indicting industry for persisting in support of work sharing but refusing to introduce a shorter workweek. It urged President Hoover to call a conference of labor and industrial leaders to devise means looking to the early adoption of the 5-day week and the 6-hour day for the nation's wage earners as the basic means of creating work opportunities for millions of idle men and women. 18. Greene conveyed the Executive Council's request to Hoover in person. The President's only response was to urge the AFL to support Share the Work and the Teagle Committee. 19. A double break with tradition came in 1932. The New York Times reported the first departure as follows. Unable to withstand the rapidly mounting tide of sentiment for compulsory unemployment insurance, evidenced by a flood of communications from local unions, city central labor bodies and state federations of labor, the Executive Council of the American Federation of Labor abandoned today, May 15, its traditional opposition to the proposal, which has been denounced by labor leaders since the days of Samuel Gompers as the dole. Green was directed by the Executive Council to formulate a compulsory unemployment insurance plan to be enacted by Congress. 20. The second departure took place at the AFL convention held in Cincinnati in November. After both Green and the Committee on the Shorter Workday called for the 5-day week and the 6-hour day with no reduction in weekly wages, the convention unanimously adopted a shorter hours resolution that included the following language: that we instruct our Executive Council to take all necessary steps toward having proper legislation presented to the incoming session of Congress. 21. In calling for the aid of the state in regulating the hours of work for men, the AFL had reversed the Gompers tradition of voluntarism. On December 21, 1932, less than 3 weeks after the Cincinnati Convention, Senator Hugo L. Black of Alabama introduced a simple bill for shorter hours. The measure called for a 30-hour week as the only practical and possible method of dealing with unemployment. It proposed to deny the channels of interstate and foreign commerce to articles produced in establishments in which any person was employed or permitted to work more than 5 days in any week or more than 6 hours in any day. 22. Speaking on a coast-to-coast radio hookup, Senator Black stressed that his bill could pass and called on all Americans to support it. Hunger in the midst of plenty is the great problem, he declared, adding that the prompt enactment of his measure, which was known as the 30-hour workweek bill, would bring about the quick employment of about 6.5 million jobless Americans, and at the same time benefit legitimate industry and languishing agriculture by increasing purchasing power. 23. Hearings on Black's bill ran from January 5 to February 11, 1933. Testifying for the bill, William Green held, "I am firmly convinced that the shorter workday and the shorter workweek must be applied generally and universally if we are to provide and create work opportunity for the millions of workmen who are idle and who are willing and anxious to work." He stated that a 30-hour week in manufacturing industries would create jobs for 1,800,000, while a universal 30-hour week in industry and government, except agriculture, would create 4,500,000 jobs. 24. The belief that technological improvements were the chief cause of unemployment and that a reduction in the length of the working week was almost the only way to offset these technological displacements was common to all the labor witnesses in favor of the Black Bill. Green insisted that industry had become so mechanized that it was utterly impossible to provide work opportunities for all workers. Unless the length of the working day came down, the United States would have to be prepared to maintain a permanent army of unemployed. 25. However, labor split on the question of what wages should be paid for a 30-hour week. One group demanded legislation that would guarantee that the same wage should be paid for 30 hours as was paid for a longer workweek. Another group only asked for a law providing a 30-hour week. Speaking for this group, Green said, "We are dealing with a 5-day workweek and a 6-hour day for private industry, for the purpose of taking up the slack incident to unemployment. Our official position is that the standard rates of wages should be maintained, but pass your bill and let us handle the question of wages." 26. Green felt that the wage for 30 hours could be made equal to the 48-hour wage because the workers' efficiency would be so increased, and IM proved that they would do practically the same amount of work. In keeping with traditional AFL policy, he opposed legislative interference with the wages of men. 27. On the other hand, those unions which were industrial unions and which included large numbers of semi-skilled and unskilled workers, favored inclusion of minimum wage provisions for all workers in the 30-hour bill, as did some in the craft unions. Sidney Hillman testified that he favored a minimum wage for men and women, and, of course, children, and the UMW announced it favored the Black Bill with a minimum wage provision. 28. Louis Weinstock, a communist activist in the Painters Union and leader of the campaign for unemployment insurance legislation in the AFL, insisted in his testimony that Green did not speak for the Federation's membership. The rank and file, he argued, were opposed to the 30-hour bill unless it provided for no cut in wages and for a minimum wage. Dr. John A. Ryan, a veteran supporter of minimum wage legislation, also charged that Green spoke only for the selfish craft interests of the skilled workers. In other words, he is more concerned with the better-paid minority than with the underpaid majority. 29. For his part, Senator Black made it clear that, although it did not include wage provisions, if his bill did not ultimately result in increasing wages, it would not serve its purpose. He argued that too much profit was going to capital and that by raising wages the bill would redress the balance between wages and profits. 30. In short, most labor groups and the sponsor of the 30-hour bill viewed it as a plan to reduce unemployment and increase the total wage payments so that the aggregate purchasing power of the masses would be increased sufficiently to increase the demand for goods and thus start the wheels of recovery. 31. On March 30, 1933, the Judiciary Committee reported the 30-hour bill favorably and urged the Senate to adopt it. In its report, The committee stated that the unemployed could not be put to work without reducing hours, that this reduction had not been and could not be accomplished by voluntary action on the part of the employers, that it had not been done by state laws, and that it could not be done by the states with sufficient rapidity to meet the emergency facing millions of destitute and unemployed citizens. 32 The debate on the Senate floor was concerned chiefly with the scope of the law itself and with the question of whether or not Congress had the constitutional power to pass such a law. Many senators representing various geographical and economic regions sought to have the dominant industries of their states exempted from the bill's provisions. These related mostly to seasonal industries and to agriculture, and amendments exempting such industries were accepted. 33. On April 6, 1933, the Senate passed the amended 30-hour week bill by a vote of 53 to 30. Great victory, exulted labor as it noted. If labor leaders of past generations would have sat in the Senate gallery last week, they would have thought themselves dreaming. When they fought for the 10-hour day and then for the 8-hour day, the whole conservative population around them blew up in their faces. Last week, Senator Black brought out his bill to restrict working time to 30 hours per week in establishments producing articles used in interstate commerce. 10 years ago, such a bill would have been smothered in committee. Last week a tremendous majority of senators, progressives and conservatives alike, were in favor of it. This marks the most amazing change in public opinion in recent American history. 34. The bill went to the House on April 17, 1933, where Congressman William P. Connery, Jr. of Massachusetts, chairman of the Labor Committee, assured the labor movement he would push for its passage. And the 30-hour bill did receive favorable action in the House Labor Committee, which urged the House to pass the measure. 35 At this point, however, the bill met with opposition that it could not overcome. On January 31, 1933, Labor had commented that a gratifying development at the Senate hearings on the Black 6-hour bill has been its strong advocacy by enlightened employers. But Black conceded that most of industry, led by the National Association of Manufacturers, vigorously opposed the bill as both a poor way to achieve recovery and as unconstitutional. 36 While this opposition could not effectively counter Black's argument that only by reducing the hours of work could idle hands and idle machines be put to productive use, in the House it received a tremendous boost from the newly inaugurated administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt opposed the 30-hour bill as economically unworkable and unconstitutional, and joined with big business in opposing its passage. Spokespersons for the administration, including Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, suggested that the National Industrial Recovery Act, then pending before the special session of Congress, would reduce hours more rapidly and, in addition, would boost wages. As a result of administration pressure, the House Rules Committee buried the 30-hour bill. 37. In discussing the defeat of the 30-hour bill, Labor took some comfort from the report making the rounds in Washington that workers were given a trade-off for the defeat of the Black-Connery bill in the form of Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which declared that every industrial code must provide, among other things, that employees shall have the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and shall be free from interference, restraint, or coercion of employees in the designation of such representatives. 38. Although Black had been skeptical of obtaining shorter hours through the National Industrial Relations Act, which turned over the writing of codes to representatives of the industries whom he considered the chief offenders, he indicated a willingness to go along with the Roosevelt administration. Connery had hoped to substitute the 30-hour bill for Title I of the NIRA. But when nothing came of this idea, he went along with Black. The NIRA bill was introduced in the House on May 23, 1933. It was given special order privileges, taking precedence over the 30-hour bill. Despite lobbying by much of industry against inclusion of Section 7A, the National Industrial Recovery Act became law on June 16, 1933, with the section included. 39. The 30-hour week did not entirely disappear with the defeat of the Black-Connery bill. Under the National Industrial Recovery Act, hours on public project ECTS, commonly known as the WPA, Works Progress Administration, were to be limited to 30 a week, so far as practicable and feasible. 40 in the main. However, the champions of the 30-hour week were doomed to disappointment by the NRA codes. The codes covered 22,022,000 workers, and in general, the workweek averaged 40 hours per week, but longer hours also prevailed, up to 48 hours. The 40-hour week was a proviso in 85% of the codes, which covered 50% of all workers. Less than 40 hours a week was provided for in 7.2% of the codes, and 12% of all workers were covered by these codes. More than 40 hours a week was provided for in the remaining 7.3% of the codes, which applied to 38% of all workers covered. 41 The fur workers compelled employers to grant a 35-hour week with no reduction in pay in the code governing their industry. 42. On March 30, 1934, the New York Times reported a miner's victory as a milestone in American labor history. That day the UMW obtained the 35-hour week, along with a wage increase, for the majority of the 350,000 bituminous coal miners of the Appalachian area, thereby becoming the first labor organization to obtain the 7-hour day and 5-day week. The new pact came as a result of direct negotiations between the coal operators of Appalachia and representatives of the UMW. The victory was marked by a wake in the Washington Hotel at which the new agreement was signed. A mock coffin, with candles burning at both ends, was set up in the hotel. An inscription on its base read, 8-hour day. Bomb April 1, 1898. Died March 26, 1934, rest in peace, 43. October 4, 1934, marked another milestone in American labor history. The International Union of Elevator Constructors announced it had reached an agreement with employers for a 5-year contract under which the 19,000 members of the union would enjoy a 30-hour week, 5-day week, 6-hour day. This, the New York Times reported, is the first major unit of the American Federation of Labor to be within sight of the goal of labor. It was especially significant since the Union of Elevator Constructors had been chosen at the 1932 AFL Convention to act as a spearhead in organized labor's fight for the shorter workweek. 44. But the Union of Elevator Constructors set no real bargaining precedent, and a new effort was made to achieve a 30-hour law at the next session of Congress. Hearings were held on 3 new bills which sought to have the 30-hour week provisions incorporated into existing codes. H.R. 8492, one of these bills, provided a 5-day week and a 6-hour day for industry with the proviso that no person should evade these provisions by working 30 hours for one employer and then working for another. It provided further that the same wages must be paid for the 30 hours as for the hours previously worked under the codes where the hours were more than 30.45. Witnesses testified at the hearings that the NERA codes had failed to reduce substantially the weekly hours of labor so that more of the unemployed could be reemployed. We asked for the 30-hour week in order to relieve the terrible ravages of unemployment among employees of the steel industry. Witnesses for steelworkers complained. That was rejected. Once again the 30-hour bills died in committee. 46. In February 1935 the original Black Bill, considerably revised, was also revived. The 1933 bill had provided that all employers of labor engaged in interstate commerce must work their employees not more than 6 hours per day, 5 days per week. The 1935 Black Bill added to this provision one stating that the government may not purchase any supplies from manufacturers who work employees more than 30 hours a week, that contractors on Public Works Project ECTS may buy only from employers complying with the 30-hour law, that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and other government lending agencies may not make or extend loans to industries that did not obey the law, and that all NERA codes should be amended so as to include these provisions for a 30-hour week and 6-hour day. 47. But in April 1935 the Senate, by a vote of 56 to 21, refused to act on Black's 30-hour bill. Black thereupon declared, I could, of course, remind the Senate that we are still feeding 20 million people, and that the only way to put them to work in private industry, seemingly, is through the adoption of shorter hours. 48. With the AFL and many of its affiliates depending on the NERA codes and on the possibility of the Black Bill becoming law, it is perhaps not too surprising that the issue did not loom very large in the labor uprising of 1933-1934 when a wave of strikes broke out all over the country. In 1933, 1,168,000 workers went out on strike, a number far exceeding that for the combined 4 years of the economic crisis from 1929 until 1932. In 1934 the number of strikers rose to 1,467,000 workers. 49. In most of these strikes the demand for shorter hours was present, but as a tangential issue, and usually took a backseat to union recognition, higher wages, or, in the case of the San Francisco General Strike of 1934 where demand was raised for a 7-hour day, to the union hiring hall. In the bloody Toledo Autolite Strike of 1934, shorter hours was mentioned, but the main emphasis was placed on a general wage increase of 20%, recognition of the union, and seniority rights for union members. 50 involving 450,000 textile workers, many of them women. The textile strike was the biggest strike of 1934. The strike demands included one for the 30-hour week, but it was acknowledged that the more important issues were union recognition, wage increases, and abolition of the stretch-out system. 51. But the situation soon changed. In May 1935, in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court declared the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional. Following the demise of the NERA codes there was an immediate reversion in private industries to the lower wages and longer hours that prevailed before the codes were put into operation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics made a study of 16 important industries to see what happened to wages and hours over the period of 12 months following the Schechter decision voiding the NERA. The Bureau found that in all 16 industries weekly hours had increased substantially during the post-National Industrial Recovery Act period. In the steel industry, for example, only 3% of the workers had been working between 41 and 48 hours a week prior to the demise of the NERA. A year later, 67% of the steelworkers worked these hours. In the hardware industry, no workers worked over 40 hours per week in May 1935. 1 year later, 56% were working between 41 and 48 hours per week. 52 A study by a special board of investigation set up by President Roosevelt to gather information on what had happened to wages and hours under the codes since the Supreme Court decision reported that in hotels, restaurants and service industries generally, the 12-hour day and 7-day week abolished in the codes have again returned. 53. Hardly had the ink dried on the Schechter decision before a number of unions went into action to retain the standards that were now threatened. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and the International Fur Workers Union called strikes to resist the lowering of wages and the increase of hours. The coal miners let it be known that they would strike if the operators increased the workweek. Surveying the situation at the end of 1936, Louis Stark of the New York Times, the most knowledgeable labor reporter in the field, observed, "Today there appears to be considerable industrial unrest because of the lengthening of work hours since the NRA was invalidated in May 1935. In some industries hours are already over 40 a week, in instances where the extension of the work period has not been accompanied by pay increases there are serious threats of strikes." 54. An unusual aspect of this situation, Stark continued, is that a large proportion of the workers affected are affiliated with unions that have membership in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, headed by John L. Lewis. 55. A year later, Lewis claimed that these unions had not only stopped the lengthening of work hours that followed the invalidation of the NERA, but also that at least 2 million workers who had affiliated with the CIO since its formation in 1935 had won a shorter week. Of these, nearly a million had achieved the 35 or 36-hour week under their agreements. He added, "What amounts to a universal maximum of 40 hours a week has been secured in all industries organized by the CIO. A 6-hour day has been won for CIO members in several industries, including flat glass workers and some of the rubber workers. Noteworthy reductions in working hours have been secured in the petroleum and textile industries." 56. The Roosevelt administration had also voiced concern over the lengthening of the workweek after the Supreme Court decision in the Schechter case. In October 1935, Labor reported that the president had voiced regret that he did not get behind the Black-Connery 30-hour week bill and push it through Congress. 57. Although no 30-hour law was enacted during the Roosevelt administration, there was legislation that did reduce working hours. This included the Motor Carriers Act of 1935, which set the maximum hours of service of employees engaged in interstate transportation in order to ensure safety of operation and equipment, the Postal Act of 1935, which fixed the hours of all postal employees except charwomen and part-time employees at 40 hours per week, the National Bituminous Coal Conservation Act of 1935, which included a regulation of labor hours for coal miners, the Maritime Hours Law of 1936, which placed licensed officers, coal passers, and sailors of vessels under the Maritime Commission on a 3-watch basis, or an 8-hour day in place of the previous 9-hour day. In addition, the Sugar Act of 1937 stipulated that children between 14 and 16 years of age must not be employed more than 8 hours a day in the beet sugar industry except where the family of the child owned the crop. But the two leading laws passed under the New Deal after the NERA was declared unconstitutional were the Public Contracts Act of 1936 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Passed June 30, 1936, the Public Contracts Act, popularly known as the Walsh-Healy Act, required, among other things, that all contractors and/or subcontractors working for the government on contracts of $10,000 or more to establish a maximum 8-hour day, 40-hour week for their employees. 58 Section 1, c, of the Act read, that no person employed by the contractor in the manufacture or furnishing of the materials, supplies, articles or equipment used in the performance of the contract shall be permitted to work in excess of 8 hours in any one day, or in excess of 40 hours in any one week. Employees covered by the Act might be employed in excess of 8 hours in any one day or in excess of 40 hours in any one week, provided that such persons were paid for any such overtime work at 1 1/2 times the basic hourly rate or piece rate at which the employee was actually paid. Where abiding by the law would impair operations of government business, work in injustice, or cause hardships, the Secretary of Labor was permitted to modify wages and hours. 59. In the Democratic Party platform on which Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1936, emphasis was placed on pledges to seek shorter hours and higher wages for all workers, especially the lower third of the working class. The overwhelming vote of confidence given Roosevelt in his re-election, in which the AFL and especially the newly organized CIO played important roles, was taken as an indication that the majority of the voters supported this objective. 60. In his annual message to Congress in January 1937, Roosevelt made no proposal in favor of wage and hour legislation. But in a special message to Congress on May 24, 1937, the President declared, "Legislation may, I hope, be passed at this session of Congress to help those who toil in factory and on farm. We have promised it. We cannot stand still." 61. Still no legislation was passed. However, the recession of 1937 set in after the end of the first session of the 75th Congress, and Roosevelt, pressured by organized labor and the unemployed, and feeling the need for immediate action to halt the economic decline, called a special session of Congress to consider labor and farm legislation. In his message to the special session, Roosevelt asked a case that has lost none of its significance. What does the country ultimately gain if we encourage businessmen to enlarge the capacity of American industry to produce, unless we see that the income of our working population actually expands to create markets to absorb that increased production? It was high time, the President told Congress, that we had legislation relating to goods moving in interstate commerce. That would accomplish two immediate purposes: banish child labor and protect workers unable to protect themselves from excessively low wages and excessively long hours. 62. On May 24, 1937, the same day on which Roosevelt in his special message urged the passage of a wage and hour law, Senator Black and Representative Connery introduced bills that had been drafted by the administration. In its main features, the new Black-Connery bill provided for federal regulation of minimum wages and maximum hours, the prohibition of child labor, and the elimination of certain labor practices such as the hiring of labor spies and professional strikebreakers. These latter provisions were dropped from the bills early because it was felt that a simple wage-hour law would have the most chance of passage. 63. Actually, no firm standards were set for wages and hours in the proposed legislation. In his message to Congress on May 24, 1937, President Roosevelt lamented, "1/3 of our population, the overwhelming majority of which is in agriculture or industry, is ill-nourished, ill-clad, and ill-housed." To remedy this situation, he urged that some means be devised to ensure, to all our able-bodied working men and women, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, through establishment of minimum wage and maximum hour standards and the elimination of child labor. There was much talk of 40 cents and 40 hours as the fair standards, but the administration did not insist on these. The bill left a blank for the exact standards to be established. 64. 3 weeks of public hearings were held before the Senate Committee on Education and Labor. After leading employers and economists had voiced opposition to the bill, Senator Black read into the record the fact that in his History of Regulation of Hours in England, published in 1875, Drive L. Brentano had observed that the movement to curtail hours enjoyed the sympathy of all men except the manufacturers and political economists of that day. 65. On July 6, 1937, the Senate Committee on Education and Labor reported out favorably an amended bill which was passed by the Senate on July 31 by a vote of 56 to 28. The House Committee on Labor immediately took the bill under consideration and on August 6 reported it favorably to the House. But the Rules Committee, dominated by a coalition of Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans, refused to permit the bill to be brought out onto the floor, preventing any vote before the session of Congress closed. 67. Having placed a wage and hour law on his must legislation list, Roosevelt called a special session of Congress for November 15, 1937, and urged that the administration bill be passed. But the same process was to be repeated as had occurred in the previous session of Congress. The Rules Committee again refused to permit the bill to come to the floor of the House. In December, however, the required 218 signatures on the petition to discharge the Rules Committee from further consideration of the bill were obtained, and the measure was placed on the floor of the House for consideration. At this point, the main opposition to the bill arose from the AFL, which feared that the CIO would be favored in the administration of the law. Accordingly, the bill was recommitted to committee. 68. Ordinarily, recommittal meant death to a proposed bill, and it appeared that the bill had been killed, both for the remainder of the special session and for the regular session, which began in January 1938. But a number of important developments changed the picture. In the Democratic primary election in Alabama, a senator who had supported the measure won a decisive and symbolic victory over a prominent anti-New Dealer. Then the poll of the Institute of Public Opinion was announced, and it showed that a big majority of the voters favored the measure, and that this was true of every section of the country with the exception of the West Central, where sentiment was evenly divided. Finally, on May 3, 1938, came the victory of Senator Claude Pepper in the Democratic senatorial primary in Florida. Pepper had been an ardent supporter of the Wages and Hours Bill, while his opponent had as ardently opposed it. 69. After the Florida primary, a petition to discharge the Rules Committee from further consideration of the bill and to bring it out on the floor of the House obtained the needed 218 signatures in less than 2.5 hours. 70. The bill, after having been modified to meet AFL objections, passed the House on May 24, 1938, by a vote of 314 to 97. A joint conference committee was then appointed to reconcile the differences between the House and Senate. On June 12, the committee presented a unanimous report, which was accepted in the House by a 291 to 89 vote, and in the Senate on a voice vote. President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act on June 25, 1938, and it became effective the following October 24.7. The last significant piece of New Deal social legislation had thus been debated in Congress for more than a year, had been rewritten several times, and forced out of the Rules Committee on 2 occasions. But as one contemporary report noted, organized labor's persistent campaign for this legislation, despite reactionary opposition, was finally victorious. 72. Not that the legislation was a radical new departure, it embodied, observes Jeremy P. Felt, in a constitutionally successful federal statute ideas on minimum wages, maximum hours, and child labor which had been the common currency of debate among social reformers for at least 30 years. 73. The Fair Labor Standards Act provided that in employment affecting interstate commerce, workers should be paid not less than 25 cents per hour during the first year, 30 cents per hour during the next 6 years, and 40 cents per hour thereafter. Less than minimum wages might be paid to learners, apprentices, mise singers, or aged and physically handicapped workers. Hours of work were limited to a maximum of 44 per week during the first year, 42 the second year, and 40 weekly thereafter except when overtime was paid for at the rate of time and 1/2. Higher maximum hours provided in bona fide collective bargaining agreements were permitted provided that no one work more than 1,000 hours in 26 or 2,000 hours in 52 consecutive weeks. In seasonal industries a 12-hour day, 56-hour week was permitted for a maximum of 12 weeks per year. Food processing industries were exempted from hour standards for 14 weeks per year. Wholly exempted from the provisions of the Act were employees in administrative, professional, or executive work, in retail establishments, in the fishing, packing, marketing, and processing of aquatic products, seamen, transport, farm, and agricultural cannery workers, and workers engaged in making cheese and butter. Willful violations of the law were punishable by a maximum fine of $10,000 or imprisonment for 6 months, or both, imprisonment applying only to the second offense. In the U.S. Department of Labor, the Act created a wage and hour division with an administrator appointed by the President. 74. Organized labor took satisfaction in the fact that the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Wages and Hours Law as it was popularly called, applied to the largest number of workers of any federal law passed. Nevertheless, it criticized the law for fixing the initial level of the maximum weekly hours too high, for being silent on the limit for daily hours of work, for failing to provide a specific and enforceable provision to ensure that the same weekly wages were maintained when weekly hours were shortened, for vagueness of the language of Section 7(b) relating to maximum hours and overtime pay, and for weaknesses in the language concerning child labor. 75. Labor's criticism of the law was mild compared to the attack launched by employers' groups. The act was denounced by the Cotton Textile Association as not indigenous to America, and by the National Association of Manufacturers as a step in the direction of communism, Bolshevism, fascism, and Nazism. 76. Big Business also attacked the act in the federal courts on constitutional grounds. But in 2 important 1941 cases the Supreme Court affirmed the constitutionality of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the machinery by which it was administered. 77. The federal government had moved vigorously, if belatedly, into the field of hours legislation during the years from 1933 to 1938. None of the laws made up for the defeat of the Black-Connery 30-hour week bills. But each one marked, as Elmer F. Andrews, administrator of the Fair Labor Standards Act, put it, another step out of the jungle. 78. 12. The hours stalemate since 1939. During the early years of the 20th century, 8-hour advocates often held that the schedule they proposed was not a recent innovation, but a return to practices which had prevailed 4 centuries before. Following the research of historian Thorold Rogers, they argued that until the very late Middle Ages frequent holidays and breaks made an 8-hour, or at most, 9-hour, day the European average before post-Reformation and industrial capitalist forces combined to lengthen the working day. Though a comforting thought insofar as it helped establish 8 hours as a traditional and natural shift, such a long view was also unsettling in that nearly half a millennium had yielded little progress and perhaps even regression. After 1938, those who accepted Rogers' view needed not to have been so disconcerted. The Fair Labor Standards Act of that year made the 8-hour day and 40-hour week the law of the land beginning October 24, 1940. But today the observer of long-term trends who accepted the reality of an 8-hour day in 1500 would again be troubled by lack of progress in shortening the length of labor. Not only, according to such a view, would it have taken 4 centuries to regain the 8-hour day, but also, in nearly a half-century since 1938, there has been little or no increase in leisure. 1. Although the picture is complicated by the post-war trends toward earlier retirement, longer vacations, overtime patterns, and a host of other factors, there is no question that the increase in leisure time has slowed greatly in the last 45 years. There is a serious possibility that negligible or negative changes in the amount of free time available to American workers have occurred. Bureau of Labor Statistics figures show a drop in average weekly working hours from 40.4 in 1947 to 40.2 in 1949, for example, but a comparison of 1949 and 1978 shows a 1.3-hour increase in average weekly working time. 2 John D. Owen's studies, which adjust basic weekly hours to account for increased holidays and vacations, demonstrate no net change of consequence for the 1948 to 1975 period. In 1976, Owen observed that, had historical trends from the pre-World War II period continued, the working week would have been more than half a day less than it actually was. The work week, according to Owen, declined from 58.4 hours per week in 1901 to 42.0 hours in 1948. It experienced little or no change since 257. Peter Hennell's somewhat earlier research revealed that the proportion of full-time, non-agricultural workers, waged and salaried, who labored 49 or more hours weekly rose from 12.9% in 1948 to 18.2% in 1965. A special labor force report treating May 1973 and May 1974 found over 16 million Americans working over 40 hours per week during both months and noted that half of these workers received no premium overtime pay. Between 1956 and 1978, about 1 worker in 20 also moonlighted in a second job, with the rate staying relatively constant. 4. Moreover, the trend toward earlier retirement has been offset by increased female participation in the labor force, especially by married women. In 1900, about 12% of an average woman's life, in years, was spent in marketed labor. By 1970, that figure was 31%. This more than compensates for a decrease among men, whose work years represented 67% of their life expectancy on the average in 1900 and 60% in 1970. In terms of hours of paid labor for total hours of life of the entire population, the ratio remained nearly constant from 1900 to 1948 and has since increased significantly. The recent work of Ivan Illich argues that this trend in female labor, combined with increased consumption of time in socially necessary activities not remunerated by wages, for example, shopping, waiting in lines, getting to work, filling out forms, translates into a society of lessening leisure. Meanwhile, 40 hours appear to have become almost sacrosanct as a lower limit for the workweek. Most plans to readjust hours ask, how many days make a workweek, while assuming a 40-hour standard. Flexitime, schedules, options allowing some employee decision-making about when to work, join plans for 4-day weeks in assuming that innovations ought not challenge the established parameters for the number of hours in a week's work. Trade unions have generally opted for what Juanita Krebs called lumps of leisure, in the form of added vacations, 3-day weekends, and earlier retirement, rather than agitating against the 40-hour week, let alone the 8-hour day. Perhaps the best index of the ebb of labor efforts in this area comes when newscasters tell of declines in the average workweek. The changes are not labor news but economic indicators. Dips in the number of hours are seen not as labor victo rise but as omens of a deteriorating economy. Benjamin Klein Honeycutt's valuable study of recent changes in the workweek is thus significantly titled, "The End of Shorter Hours." It proclaims, and with some reason, that the shorter hour movement stopped after the Depression. 10. This chapter argues that the picture of shorter hours progress since 1938 is not so unrelievedly bleak as Honeycutt's provocative work implies, and that the prospects for future gains are not bleak at all. Nonetheless, Honeycutt and others are right in pointing to a marked decline in the struggle to reduce hours. In examining why the shorter hours movement has been so long moribund, and then in arguing that it has still not died, this chapter proceeds chronologically. But it also lingers over points that help account for the paucity of post-war progress, the legacy of depression and war, the demography of the post-war working class, labor law, alienated leisure, alienated work, the purging of union radicals, consumerism, and the strategies of labor's leadership. During the months between the 1938 passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the December 1941 entry of the United States into World War II, there was substantial headway in reducing hours. Not only did the 40-hour provision of the Fair Labor Standards Act give about 2 million workers that schedule when it took effect on October 24, 1940, but many unions fought for and won weeks of below 40 hours. In particular, the hours issue continued to be a rallying point for AFL militancy during a period in which that organization opposed CIO organizing efforts. Craft union leaders, especially those of the carpenters, photo engravers, electrical workers, and others in the building trades, legitimated themselves to their memberships by extending reductions in the working day, even as they mounted a destructive campaign against the CIO as a communist organization. The October 1938 Carpenter, for example, counted 7 cities, mainly in the Northwest, with contracts for 6-hour days, 8 more, including New York City, reported a 7-hour standard. The American photo engraver listed Youngstown, Akron, Philadelphia, Chicago, Rochester, Washington, D.C., Davenport, Rock Island, New York City, Boston, Cleveland, Providence, Baltimore, Detroit, and San Diego as sites of 37.5-hour or 35-hour week successes in 1939 and 1940. The AFL consistently reaffirmed its endorsement of the 6-hour workday without any reduction in pay, and argued that both cyclically and technologically caused unemployment necessitated such a change. At its 1940 convention, the AFL even entertained and referred to the Executive Council, a 6-hour shift resolution applying to defense industries. In 1940, despite large increases of hours in the defense sector and decreases in part-time employment, no appreciable rise in average working hours occurred. 12. However, with U.S. entry into the war, labor's position became more defensive where the working day was concerned. Pearl Harbor had hardly been bombed before many industrialists launched a drive to abandon the 40-hour week, linking the fall of France to the shortening of working hours there. World War I aviation hero Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, by the Second War and Aviation Executive, toured the nation speaking against 40 hours. Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia even held, in late 1942, that shorter hours had contributed to American military defeats. This came despite a 1942 rise in the average workweek in manufacturing industries from 40.6 to 43.1 hours, the second biggest annual increase in the 20th century. Indeed, by February 1942, more than half of all war materiel plants worked over 48 hours weekly. In machine shops, the average was 55 hours, with 70 hours per worker per week not uncommon. Nor did the fact that the workweek rose by 7.1 hours in manufacturing industries between 1940 and 1944 disarm labor's critics. Similarly, although women war plant workers normally worked 48-hour weekly schedules by 1942, protective legislation governing the schedules of females came under attack. 13. Confronting this campaign and supporting a war more prolonged and more noble in its aims than World War I, labor made concessions regarding the working day. Early in the war, for example, double time for Sunday and holiday work came to be abandoned in most industries, often with union consent, upon a request from War Production Board Chairman Donald M. Nelson. In some instances, AFL unions were more zealous in defending hours standards than their CIO counterparts. In the auto industry, for example, the UAW leadership moved forcefully to end overtime premiums and subsequently lost a series of representative representation elections to the AFL's International Association of Machinists over the premium pay issue. 14. In its conventions, the AFL was more active than the CIO in pillorying anti-labor interests seeking to abolish the 40-hour week, and more persistent in raising 30 hours as an ultimate goal. The AFL, joined by the railway labor paper, Labor, also insisted early in the war that overtime not be greatly increased while large numbers of Americans remained out of work. In no case, according to the AFL, was a workweek of more than 48 hours efficient. In particular, the AFL protested, at its 1942 convention, against war production plants which, even at this late hour, are not operating around the clock, but which instead depended on overtime work, long hours per day and sometimes 7 days per week. 15. The wartime issues of wages and hours proved inseparable, much to the detriment of any campaign to reduce the latter. The Roosevelt administration applied the Little Steel formula after July 16, 1942, in computing wage increases permissible in war labor board decisions. It also increasingly limited the board's power to correct wage inequalities by granting pay boosts. Since the labor movement argued that the Little Steel guidelines did not nearly permit wages to keep pace with prices, let alone with profits, both the AFL and CIO had serious wage grievances during the war. 16. An administration policy which partly compensated for conservative wage guidelines was to increase hours. After brief defenses of the 8-hour day, and of no more than 8 hours overtime weekly, by a host of government agencies in 1942, Roosevelt instituted a minimum 48-hour workweek with Executive Order No. 9301 on February 9, 1943. The order, applying wherever the War Manpower Commission deemed it necessary, came just a day after an extremely unfavorable wage decision in the Big Four meatpacking cases. The 48-hour decree, monthly labor review promised, is expected to result in substantial increases in the weekly earnings of a large number of workers. 17. With the overtime provision of the Fair Labor Standards Act intact, unions generally did not oppose the 48-hour order, though many employers, reluctant to pay overtime premiums and to yield control over scheduling, did offer opposition. Labor noted that corporate leaders had cried for long hours and continued to yell when they got them. 18. Just as extra work smoothed over wage problems for the unions supporting a no-strike pledge and government industry labor cooperation during the war, it ultimately helped to do so also for John L. Lewis and the UMW, who challenged the terms of that cooperation. Lewis' long, controversial, and finally successful campaign to secure wage increases for miners in excess of the Little Steel guidelines generated a series of work stoppages and truces between January and November 1943. The UMW began with a 35-hour workweek as part of its negotiating package but eventually accepted slight increases in working time as part of a War Labor Board decision granting a 21% pay boost. 19. Besides contributing to a tendency to sacrifice shorter hours for overtime pay, the war had two other effects on the movement to reduce the hours of labor. The less important of these was to remultiply the tremendous volume of litigation and hearings stemming from the Fair Labor Standards Act, particularly from employer attempts to evade the hours and overtime provisions of that law. The war witnessed a vigorous and mostly successful drive by employers to exclude canneries from the Fair Labor Standards Act. It saw also the major judicial defeat for labor in Walling v. A.H. Bellow Corporation, a Supreme Court decision on the law's overtime provisions, an unfavorable executive order on premium pay, and a morass of War Labor Board hearings and decisions, often productive of contradictory precedents regarding hours and overtime. After the war, the Labor Board would lapse, but the great volume of complex litigation would not. 20. The final important impact of the war, and of the period of relatively full employment under a no-strike pledge concomitant with it, was to encourage informal, extra-union protests against long hours and forced overtime. Such protests included slowdowns, wildcat strikes, absenteeism, and high turnover. Women workers, burdened with household as well as wage labor, and poorly supported by social services, proved especially likely to quit jobs and to take time off from 6-day weeks. One study concluded that, in Detroit alone, as many as 100,000 worker hours per month were lost to the necessity of women workers staying home to do laundry. Turnover was great among both sexes, especially before War Manpower Commission curbs on job changes began in September 1943.21. Some will find in the many wartime quits, absences, and wildcats, evidence of a working-class assertiveness against overwork even when formal channels of protest are blocked or when workers do not wish to undertake formal protests. Others will note that such informal and individual styles of opposition to long hours, strengthened by the war and strong since, have not succeeded in reducing the length of the working day. With the close of the war, fears of massive unemployment as troops returned gave urgency to shorter hours arguments. Again, it was the AFL which responded with particular energy. At its 1944 convention, the AFL called for enactment of a 6-hour day, 30-hour week law to take effect immediately upon the cessation of the fighting. On September 30, 1946, the AFL's weekly news service proclaimed, "The 40-hour week, once labor's proudest boast, is doomed to be discarded within the foreseeable future. The 30-hour week is bound to come." 22. The CIO did not include shorter hours in its re-employment plan of 1944 or in resolutions thereafter, but confined itself to calls for elimination of overtime and for longer vacations and more holidays. Nonetheless, important CIO unions, including the United Auto Workers, UAW, and the United Steel Workers, USW, resolved in favor of 30 for 40 inches, a 30-hour week for 40 hours pay, between 1943 and 1947.23. The AFL, UAW, and USW all kept their shorter hours commitments largely confined to paper, however. For the craft unionists in the AFL, the reduction of hours demand found justification almost entirely on the grounds of spreading work. When high unemployment did not occur after the war, the shorter work week campaign in the AFL lost steam. After interest in the demand revived amidst signs of economic slowdown in 1948 and 1949, the AFL's Committee on a Shorter Workday acknowledged that its work had lapsed during the previous years. 24 For the top leadership in auto and steel, shorter hours was a distant goal. The guaranteed annual wage and alliances with Liberal Democrats in support of Keynesian economic policies were much preferred as anti-recession, anti-unemployment measures by the UAW and USW leaders. So committed was the UAW's Walter Reuther to these priorities that he often attacked 30 for 40 inches as an ill-timed and even subversive demand in the early and middle 1950s. 25 The logic of the Labor-Liberal Democrat coalition was best displayed in the lobbying to pass the Full Employment Act of 1946. Both labor leaders and the Democrats agreed then that fiscal policy, military spending, and overseas expansion of markets, not trade union action or legislation for less hours, would be used to fulfill the goals of the law. 26. The decision of union leaders to concentrate on issues other than the reduction of hours reflected the demands of the rank and file to some extent, though the question is by no means a simple one. The great post-war labor initiatives for rounds of wage increases in industry after industry through 1949, and especially in the huge and extended strike wave of 1945 and 1946, expressed pent-up consumer demands, deferred through depression and war. For many workers, shorter hours may have suffered by association with the poorly remunerated work-sharing years of the 1930s. Returning veterans, marrying, buying homes on credit and starting families, needed wages. They continued to do so during the baby boom of the post-war years. Prosperity and consumer credit also made it possible for workers to buy leisure goods, such as cabins, fishing boats, outboards, and skis, better used in large lumps of leisure, such as vacations and holidays. More wages made for more such purchases. The tasks of home maintenance also made vacations, which had grown to affect 85% of all workers covered in collective bargaining agreements by 1944 after covering just 1 in 4 in 1940, an appealing option. 27. Nonetheless, it will not do to portray American workers as driven by demography and pent-up demand or as seduced by consumer-oriented leisure in explaining the decline of post-war shorter hours activity. As sociologist Alvin Goldner emphasized at the time and as historian George Lipsitz has recently reiterated, control and dignity were often important issues even in strikes ostensibly fought over wages. 28. Moreover, despite blowing hot and cold by the major unions, the immediate post-war years did witness some substantial progress in reducing the workweek, at the very time when we might expect wage consciousness to have been at its zenith. Between 1948 and 1957, the proportion of full-time wage and salaried workers laboring less than 40 hours weekly rose from 4.8% to 7.5%, while that of those working more than 40 hours plummeted from 43.4% to 33.1%. 29. Some of the most important challenges to government wage price policies during reconversion involved the hours of labor. Among the industrial unions, the mine and rubber workers blazed trails where the workweek was concerned. Lewis led the miners, in anthracite and bituminous fields, in a series of strikes and negotiations in 1945 and 1946. These conflicts featured a government takeover and operation of mines in the bituminous fields beginning on May 22, 1946, and then sharp conflict between Lewis and the government over wages and work rules. The result of these mine battles was a succession of contracts preserving the pre-war standard of a basic 7-hour day with wage increases in part provided by full, portal-to-portal pay. 30. Rubber workers at the Goodyear and Firestone plants in Akron struck in September 1945 to regain the 6-hour day, with a 6-day week, which had prevailed before the war. Some Detroit rubber factories and a few in Los Angeles also adopted that schedule. 31. Several industrial unions feared that large amounts of overtime obscured poor basic wage rates and therefore called for 40 for 48 inches or some variation of that demand, seeking a return to the actual 40-hour week at wages equal to the then current weekly rates. This was a bargaining position of the National Federation of Telephone Workers, later to evolve into the Communications Workers of America, in December 1945 and was proposed by a conference of UAW local officers representing 400,000 members in June 1945. The oil workers International Union fought for a 52 for 40 inches plank in a huge strike beginning in September 1945 and secured wage boosts despite government seizure and reopening of refineries. 32. The UM's 1946 bituminous strike tried, but failed, to reduce the actual 9-hour day. In 1947, the UMW did secure a normal 8-hour day in the bituminous fields, but at the cost of having overtime computed on the basis of a 40-hour, not 35, week. President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9651, issued on October 30, 1945, specifically opposed 40 for 48, and in the auto, coal, and other negotiations after the war, and the president adhered to that opposition. 33. Among the craft unions, the most active advocates of reductions below 40 hours weekly were in the printing trades. Hour week with 2 weeks vacation annually and won a 36.25-hour schedule without a strike, despite withholding of support by the International Union. Thereafter, the less than 40-hour week spread rapidly among lithographers. After a breakthrough in Chicago in 1953, the national trend was toward a 35-hour week for lithographers. Such a standard applied to 85% of all members by 1957.34. Chicago was likewise the pacesetter in the international typographical union's post-war fight for shorter hours. The printers stressed not just the creation of jobs but also health when arguing for reductions in the workweek. In October 1945, 3,000 of the union's job printers in Chicago struck for 3 weeks and gained a 36.25-hour week, setting a precedent for similar gains by over 100,000 print workers over the next few months. By 1956, the printing trades outdistanced all other segments of American labor in their proportion of workers on normal schedules of less than 40 hours weekly. 35. Most productive of shorter hours progress, and of rancor from the Truman administration, in the immediate post-war years were a series of strikes and threat-end strikes in the transportation industry, particularly among rail and maritime workers. In the Wages and Rules campaigns, undertaken by 20 railway unions in 1945 and continuing through 1949, among the most vital of the rules disputes were those over the working day. Shop craftsmen in 7 unions joined railroad dispatchers in agitating for a 36-hour week in 1945. Other unions, such as that of the trainmen, fought for complex hours and overtime demands, usually centering on making the 5-day, 40-hour week apply throughout the railroad industry. The Brotherhood of Railway Signalmen's post-war demands included 40 for 48 inches 36. In May 1946, all but two of the rail unions agreed to defer to Truman and drop rules demands while submitting wage issues to arbitration. When the defiant trainmen and engineers tested the president with a May 23, 1946, strike, the former union specifically cited hours grievances as causing the walkout. Truman broke the strike by appealing to Congress for a law granting him the power to fire and draft strikers in a national emergency. The two striking unions had to give up the rule changes they had sought when they were forced to return to work. A.F. Whitney, head of the trainmen, continually protested against Truman's intervention and defended proposed rule changes shortening the working day. He met with some success in such rules negotiations by November 1947.37. Among the many railway unionists not involved in actual operation of the trains, the 40-hour week had not yet been achieved. Telegraphers still regularly worked 7-day weeks. On May 30, 1945, their leader, V.O. Gardner, left negotiations with employers pledging, "We'll not take less than reduction to a 6-day week." By July 18, 1945, the telegraphers had made this basic reform a reality through most of the industry, though 5 railway carriers held out for a time thereafter. 38. From May through July 1948, as the U.S. Army ran railroads seized in the face of a wages and rules strike threat by engineers, firemen, and switchmen. The 16 railway unions representing non-operating rail employees came together in a campaign which the railway clerk Vias layered to praise as leading to the most notable advance made in many years in wages and working conditions. The unions demanded 48 for 40, overtime pay on Saturdays and Sundays, and wage increases. When a September 8 to 17, 1948, conference failed to settle the disputes between the carriers and non-operating unions, a strike vote was slated for September 18. It passed overwhelmingly, but negotiations continued until October 13. Truman appointed an emergency board as a strike loomed. The board's recommendations, given to Truman on December 17, 1948, gave the unions 48 for 40, and an additional hourly pay raise of 7 cents. After further delays, an agreement based on the board's recommendations was signed on March 19, 1949. The head of the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way employees termed the pact the second revolutionary change in railroad labor relations, ranking its 40-hour week provision with the achievement of the 8-hour day 4 decades before. 39. Strikes and cooperation among unions also brought changes in the workweek in the maritime industry. An October 1945 strike by New York longshoremen, submitted to arbitration after 8 days, resulted in a decrease of weekly hours from 44 to 40, a 20% pay boost and a week of paid vacation annually. The Great Lakes strike among National Maritime Union seamen in August 1946 demanded shorter hours and won a 48-hour week at sea and 44 in port. In May 1946, 7 maritime unions began cooperation under CIO auspices in the Committee for Maritime Unity, CMU, which called for a 40-hour week at sea as one of its major goals. A month later, with most offshore vessels still under federal control and with the CMU threatening a June 15 strike, Truman made plans to use the armed forces to break any such work stoppage. On June 14, the various unions involved settled without a strike. In addition to wage gains, licensed seamen and radio operators won a basic 48-hour week at sea and 40 in port, decreases of 8 and 4 hours respectively. Engineers secured a 40-hour week in port and overtime for Sunday work. After several wage strikes in early September 1946, licensed deck officers and engine officers struck for shorter hours, more pay, and union security on September 30. That strike, supported by the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, won a 48-hour week and a 15% pay, 40 increase. The impetus for shorter hours action did not quickly dissipate after the war. In 1953 and 1954, for example, UAWGM Subcouncil No. 7, Ford Local 600, Flint Chevrolet Local 659, the CIO State Convention in California, the Pennsylvania CIO, and the CIO's Textile, Packing House, Clothing, and Woodworkers unions all adopted shorter workweek resolutions, mostly of the 30 for 40 inches variety. By the time the merged AFL-CIO held its conference on shorter hours of work in September 1956, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union had won a 35-hour week, as had bakers in San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Seattle, and other West Coast cities. Nearly a third of all American newspaper guild members had a 35-hour week, and almost half of organized brewery workers were on a 37.5-hour weekly schedule. About one building tradesman in 8 had a 7-hour day, and a large proportion of office and municipal employees had less than 40-hour workweeks. For segments of the labor force in iron and steel forging, a 30-hour week was obtained, as it was for some union plasterers. 4 feet. The progress of the shorter hours movement between 1945 and 1956 was not great by comparison to pre-World War II standards, but it was substantial by comparison to the stasis and retreat of the post-1956 years. In accounting for the limits of this mixed post-war success, more than the attitudes of union leaders and rank-and-file workers deserve mention. Other factors, particularly what David Siskind has called the countermarch of labor legislation in the post-war years and the rise of intense anti-communism, also merit emphasis. 42. Changes in the Fair Labor Standards Act and in the National Labor Relations Wagner Act in 1947 badly hurt labor efforts for shorter hours. The alteration of the former law came with the passage of the Portal-to-Portal Act. In June 1946, the Supreme Court decreed, in the Mount Clemens Pottery Company case, that employees could sue for recovery of back pay for time spent walking to the job on plant premises and spent in preliminary activities, such as putting on aprons and overalls, removing shirts, taping or greasing arms, putting on fingier cots, preparing equipment, and so on. By January 1947, workers had won nearly $6 billion in over 1,500 such cases, with 398 cases still outstanding. The cases came at a time when many unions were agitating for full portal-to-portal pay and appeared to be an important labor victory. However, congressional reaction to the Supreme Court's decision produced the Portal-to-Portal Act in 1947, a law which forbade compensation on claims not based on contracts for the period before May 14, 1947, permitted compromises on compensation due, and set a 2-year statute of limitations on claims. The act also provided that employers could escape liability for past or future offenses if they could show they acted in good faith, or in reliance on a government administrator's guidelines. As Department of Labor officials Harry Weiss and Robert Grunewald observed, the act institutionalized a significant loosening of standards for the measurement of working hours. 43. Far more damaging than the Portal-to-Portal Act, though less direct in its impact upon the working day, was the Taft-Hartley revision of the National Labor Relations Act. Passed over a Truman veto on June 23, 1947, Taft-Hartley represented the triumph of big and small business and manufacturing interests attempting to blunt labor militancy. The Taft-Hartley amendments, though they reflected previous precedents in labor law and National Labor Relations Board (NLRB) practice, constitute the most important piece of anti-labor legislation in U.S. history. 44 Taft-Hartley's provisions included the outlawing of secondary boycotts and jurisdictional strikes and the granting to employers of the right to sue when such actions did occur. The law outlawed the closed shop and gave state legislatures the right to ban the union shop. It set into motion a series of legal decisions circumscribing sympathy strikes, setting severe limits on a tactic that had historically been most significant in extending shorter hours protest. Irony Cali, the Fair Labor Standards Act, a far more positive piece of labor legislation, had earlier limited the number of organizational strikes for shorter hours by prohibiting the 40-hour week in many unorganized workplaces. Taft-Hartley limited picketing rights. It gave the president the power to declare that a strike will imperil national health or safety, then to appoint a fact-finding board, and to institute a 60-day cooling-off period during which strikers would be forced to return to work and during which the NLRB would supervise a referendum on the employer's last offer. The law forbade unions from proceeding in unfair labor practice cases unless their officers and the officers of any national or international labor organization of which it is an affiliate or constituent unit filed affidavits certifying that they were not associated with the Communist Party. It declared illegal and specified stiff penalties for strikes by public employees. Labor lawyer and historian Stoughton Lynn's comment on one provision of Taft-Hartley, that its thrust is to outlaw working-class solidarity, applied well to the whole act. Taft-Hartley made effective trade union activity, and thus also shorter hours initiatives, far more difficult. 45. Indeed, perhaps the least appreciated part of Taft-Hartley, a section in Title III of the law, contributed most to the decline of protest over the length of labor. That section facilitated the legal enforcement of collective bargaining agreements by making unions liable for violations. It codified the employer's decisive remedy for wildcat strikes and slowdowns through lawsuits against the entire union. This effective attack on informal protests over conditions encouraged shop stewards and paid union officials to participate in causing rank-and-file workers to accept what David Brody has called the workplace rule of law. It reinforced wartime tendencies among workers to see unions as cooperating with management in maintaining shop floor discipline and solidified the accompanying tendencies to not press control issues or to press them outside of union channels. 46. This weakening and reorienting of control struggles had an effect on the quality of leisure. Studies from the 1950s and early 1960s, though tending to blame mass culture for what was perceived as an increasingly debased and conformist life off the job among most Americans, occasionally illuminated the relationship between unfulfilling work and unsatisfying play. Sociologist David Reisman's preface to the 1961 edition of The Lonely Crowd, for example, corrected the emphasis of the original edition of that classic study by castigating the burden put on leisure by the disintegration of work. Reisman added, "Leisure itself cannot rescue work, but fails with it, and can only be meaningful for most men if work is meaningful." Empirical research meanwhile showed those with the most decision-making opportunities on the job to be the best able to use time away from the job. A few critics, most notably Herbert Marcuse, joined Reisman in affirming what we could have learned from the history of hours struggles in the early 20th century. That is, the treasuring of leisure best coexists with the treasuring of meaningful work. 47 with Taft-Hartley limiting control initiatives on the job, and with much of the labor movement holding the position it first articulated in the 1920s. That shorter hours could be won by trading off control prerogatives. The movement for leisure withered. 4 * leisure came to be viewed, by social critics from both the left and right, as a problem. A 1963 Gallup poll which found just 42% of union members in favor of a 35-hour workweek suggests that many workers may have shared the critics' views. 49. The most serious consequences for the shorter hours movement stemming from the Cold War and from the expulsion of the communist-influenced unions from the CIO in 1949 and 1950 were indirect ones. If the communist-influenced unionists and unions displayed more concern with the working day in the immediate post-war period than did non- and anti-communists in the unions, the differences were less than dramatic. Communist influence in some of the maritime unions, especially the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, coincided with emphasis on achieving shorter hours, but opponents of the communists also stressed that issue. Harry Bridges, the ILWU head indicted in 1949 for swearing in a naturalization affidavit that he was not a communist, was a staunch opponent of overtime work and, in 1959 and 1960, negotiated a widely publicized West Coast longshore agreement providing a guaranteed 35-hour week and lowering retirement from 65 to 62. The left-led Food, Tobacco, Agricultural and Allied Workers Union gained a 40-hour week, down from 50, for Reynolds Tobacco Company workers in Winston-Salem between 1943 and 1947 before falling victim to red baiting and race baiting. The United Electrical Workers also vigorously agitated for a shorter workweek. 50. However, on the whole, communist-influenced trade union leaders, like their adversaries in the unions, emphasized wages and, to a lesser extent, vacations after the war. At times, the communists' anti-racist emphasis even put them in a position of having to warn against viewing a 30-hour week as a panacea. For example, in 1950 Hal Simon wrote in the communist journal Political Affairs, "The general struggle for jobs for workers as a whole should not be permitted to submerge the special struggle for jobs that must be conducted in relation to Negro workers." He added, "The achievement of the 30-hour week will not end discrimination." 51. But anti-communism must nonetheless be counted as a factor of importance in any weighing of the reasons for the limited progress of the post-war shorter hours movement. Red baiting contributed, of course, to the passage of Taft-Hartley. It decimated union membership, particularly CIO membership. It dissipated organizing energies in raids and jurisdictional battles. It helped to cause the failure of the Operation Dixie campaign to organize the South after the war, and it stalled white-collar organization. In short, it weakened the labor movement as a whole. 52. Where hours were more specifically concerned, anti-communism split trade unions, especially in the maritime industry, at a critical time in struggles over the workweek. Furthermore, communists in many localities and industries resisted labor management cooperation and, in shop floor struggles, defended workers' rights on day-to-day control issues. Their removal helped to solidify among workers the idea that the pursuit of dignity and control on the job would take place largely outside union channels. Moreover, unions repeatedly connected their acceptance of long hours with Cold War preparedness, as the Machinist did in 1957 when it headlined the question, "Will Soviets cut their overtime?" 53. The 1955 reunification of the labor movement promised, with the formation of the AFL-CIO, a renewal of labor strength and trade union unity and thus greater possibilities for the reduction of working hours. Indeed, on September 11, 1956, George Meany convened the Merged Organizations Conference on Shorter Hours of Work with a sense of history and of hope. "It is significant," he said, "that this is the first conference on a collective bargaining subject to be held under the auspices of the AFL-CIO." 54. But if Meany's hard-hitting opening address, and the very existence of the conference, suggested major AFL-CIO initiatives to come, the actual proceedings of the 1956 meeting showed deep division in the labor movement regarding the hours of work, and presaged the unsteady, start-and-stop course of future AFL-CIO actions. George Brooks, the research director of the Pulp, Sulfite, and Paper Mill Union, followed Meany to the rostrum, ostensibly to provide historical background regarding the working day. But Brooks also treated the present, holding that the evidence is all see and the other side, from the contention that American workers wanted shorter hours. Workers, according to Brooks, are eager to increase their income, not to work fewer hours. The conference, Brooks maintained, needed to avoid any ethical judgments about the morality or desirability of shorter hours. Brooks added that, in any case, reduction of hours would not effectively control mass unemployment. 55 of the 16 union officials commenting on Brooks's speech, only a handful questioned his conclusions regarding overtime hunger, the preference among workers for wages rather than leisure, and the inefficacy of work sharing as an unemployment cure. 56 other speakers complained, with, as Sylvia Gottlieb of the Communications Workers of America keenly observed, little evidence beyond allegations, that a 6-hour day merely fueled moonlighting. Otto Pragen of the International Chemical Workers Union held that labor productivity has lost its importance as an argument for shortening the hours of work. 57 A corporate spokesperson might easily have pirated much of the proceedings to show labor denying in turn the major reasons for a shorter workweek. 2 penetrating conference comments cut to the core of AFL-CIO problems in developing an hour strategy. Pragen pointed out that the movement to reduce hours below 40 did not enjoy the support from reformers nor the union Solidar Ity, which earlier campaigns for a shorter day had elicited. The movement for the 8-hour day was a social movement spearheaded by the whole labor movement and the liberal forces in the United States. The movement was based on economic as well as moral grounds. Today, the drive for shorter hours is not a nationwide movement. Changing the standard workweek is an economic problem in a few selected industries. Pragen might have added that, in contrast to the 8-hour campaigns of the World War I era, few reform economists and even fewer employers were willing to vouch for the efficiency of further shortening hours. 58. Moreover, having lost its emphasis on moral, let alone class-conscious, raise sons to reduce hours, the labor movement rested its shorter week case on 2 props which, as UAW Speaker Nat Weinberg's shrewd comments made clear, did not always stand well together. That is, the arguments that shorter hours led to increased productivity and to decreased unemployment caused a quandary in which, according to Weinberg, we can contradict ourselves, because high productivity would erode the job-producing aspects of shorter hours. Weinberg advocated large cuts in the workweek to offset the potential advanced in productivity that will flow not only from normal technological innovations but also from the impact of the reduction of the workweek itself. But almost all the other speakers predicted slow reform at best. 59. Such slow projected changes created yet another problem in hours strategy. If only 15 or 30 minutes per day could be cut for working time, how should such reductions be packaged? To add to breaks or lunch hours did not reduce the time required in a shift. To make a small cut every day might hardly seem worthwhile, especially since travel and preparation time remained the same. A 4-day week of 8-hour days was thought to be practically precluded. But a 4.5-day week was probably not efficient. To work 4 days of 9 or 9+ hours violated long insistence on the 8-hour day. The result was further union emphasis on vacations and, for a time, even the sabbatical leave, as the most practical ways to accumulate and apportion small doses of leisure. 60. Given these problems, it is not surprising that in his 1957 keynote address to the AFL-CIO convention Meany ignored shorter hours. Indeed, the pattern suggested by the 1956 conference and the lack of follow-up at the 1957 convention became the hallmark of trade union action and inaction on the working day. It was not a useful strategy, this blowing hot and not at all on the hours issue. Between 1957 and 1978, the proportion of workers putting in fewer than 40 hours per week increased only from 7.5% to 9.4%. Meanwhile, those working 49 or more hours rose from 14.3% to 20.6% of all full-time wage and salaried workers. 61 Such figures, dismal as they are, do not reflect union inattention to the reduction of hours, but rather ineffective, episodic attention. The AFL-CIO felt increasing pressure from its constituent unions for shorter hours action in the late 1950s. In 1957, the Machinists and the International Union of Electrical Workers called for a shorter workweek. Walter Reuther of the UAW, though subordinating the issue to a guaranteed annual wage, advocated a 4-day week. David MacDonald, leader of the steelworkers, proposed either a 4-day week or a 3 to 4 month sabbatical every 5 years, and his union went into its 1959 bargaining session with the shorter workweek as a central demand. 62. Although the tendency was to drop these demands in bargaining, the AFL-CIO took note of interest in them, especially in periods of higher than usual unemployment. In 1959, the AFL-CIO convention heard 35-hour week proposals, 30 hours having been dropped, from the International Jewelry Workers Union, the New York AFL-CIO, and the Metal Trades Department, and resolved to press for such a reform through public education and an active militant collective bargaining program. 2 years later, Reuther himself introduced a resolution for creating job opportunities by reducing work time. After noting that International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW, Local 3 in New York City had demanded a 4-hour day and that Meany's plumbers union worked a 6-hour schedule, the convention linked shorter hours with a forthcoming conference on unemployment. The 1963 convention reaffirmed an AFL-CIO goal to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to provide for a standard 35-hour workweek without reduction in take-home pay, and heard 9 shorter workweek resolutions. 63. These resolutions produced few concrete results. Although McDonald pressed Sir John F. Kennedy to declare that he favored a 32-hour workweek during the 1960 election, he later recalled that Kennedy wouldn't buy it and refused to say anything kind about it, even privately. 64. Kennedy's Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz, did advocate a 35-hour week or less now and later on. God knows only how short it will be, at the 1963 AFL-CIO convention, but no serious Democratic or Republican support for amending the Fair Labor Standards Act materialized during a period in which Kennedy referred to unemployment as the major domestic challenge of the 60s. Indeed, the Kennedy administration opposed Congressman Adam Clayton Powell's 1961 bill for a phased-in 35-hour week. The AFL-CIO continued to show ambivalence on the hours issue, with McDonald grudgingly admiring Kennedy's refusal to yield to 32-hour pressure and with top unionists, as Dan Wakefield observed in 1963, often portraying less hours as a regrettable measure to cure joblessness. 65 Scattered breakthroughs in bargaining included the steelworkers' 1963 negotiation of the first sabbaticals for industrial workers included in an industrial collective bargaining agreement, and shorter hours pacts for white-collar workers negotiated by the office and professional employees in turn a Tional union, which went on record for a 4-day, 32-hour week in 1962.66. By far the most significant advance occurred when IBEW Local 3 in New York City followed up its 1961 demand for a 4-hour day to eliminate unemployment with a solid strike over the issue in January and February 1962. Local 3, part of a union that had pioneered in shorter hours since the late 1930s and led brilliantly by Harry Van Arsdale Jr., saw the employer's negotiators at first refuse to discuss the hours issue. But the strike, authorized by a 5,000-3 vote, forced bargaining and generated a compromise of a 5-hour day and 25-hour week. The agreement drew a large volume of publicity, but little emulation. 67. During the relatively full employment coincident with American involvement in Vietnam, the AFL-CIO paid little attention to the reduction of hours. A 1967 resolution on the subject stressed socially desirable job-creating fiscal and monetary policies as the major cure for joblessness, but added that a 35-hour week was necessary, as fast as practicable. Shorter hours also found justification as one of several efforts to share productivity gains. The most interesting aspect of the 1967 hours resolutions was a call for punitive overtime pay at the rate of double time to discourage forced, regularly scheduled overtime. In 1969, the AFL-CIO's shorter hours demands were embedded in a resolution that merely mandated the AFL-CIO to investigate the feasibility of introducing federal legislation for a 35-hour workweek. 68. The movement for shorter hours during the Vietnam War largely took place in small campaigns against overtime, sometimes under union auspices, more often informally, and in the decisions of countless, especially young, workers to absent themselves from work, sometimes on a regular basis. The latter phenomenon, particularly observed by sociologists and lamented by managers at the model General Motors factory at Lordstown, Ohio, helped to spawn a huge literature concerning absenteeism, turnover, and the revolt against work. But it generated little from management, social scientists, the unions, or the rank and file in the way of sustained calls for more leisure. 69. With few shorter hours efforts forthcoming from most unions or party politicians, the shorter hours activities of left-wing groups became more important. The Communist Party, League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and Progressive Labor Party, PL, were especially active in this regard. 70. The League, based in Detroit, and its offshoot, the Black Workers Congress, BWC, effectively linked hours with control over work and fought vigorously against the UAW's acceptance of virtually forced overtime in its 1973 negotiations, branding the contract of that year a 54-hour week, packed and agitating for a 20-hour workweek. PL meanwhile made 30 for 40, a familiar demand in the Students for a Democratic Society and in some union locals. In 1973, PETA leaders organizer William Gilbreth led a wildcat sit-down strike at the Mack Avenue Chrysler plant. The strike raised the 30 for 40 demand before being broken by police, UAW officials, and management. Although both the BWC and PL suffered from a tendency to disparage the importance of existing unions, these groups gave the hours issue some prominence. 71. In 1975, a new momentum for a shorter workweek developed, especially among unionists at the local and state level. 300 delegates to the Illinois AFL-CIO convention signed a 30 for 40 resolution that year, and the coalition of black trade unionists endorsed such a demand. The 1975 AFL-CIO National Convention resolved to strive for a 35-hour week. The following year, Sar Levitan and Richard Bellis of George Washington University's Center for Social Policy Studies predicted, if stickiness in unemployment continues much longer, pressures for shortening work times will mount and become heavier than during any time since the dawn of the post-World War II era. 72 In 1976, the National Steelworkers Rank and File Report endorsed 30 for 40 and termed a shorter workweek the number one need of American steelworkers. Ed Sadlowski, the reform candidate for the steelworkers presidency, emphasized a 6-hour day. The Committee for Trade Union Action and Democracy made shorter hours a major part of its agitational activities, bringing together a variety of unionists around the issue. At the 1976 Illinois AFL-CIO convention, a massive petition campaign aimed at shorter hours with no pay reduction won unanimous endorsement. 73. In the fall of 1976, the UAW, under pressure from the Auto Workers Action Caucus and other rank and file groups to make a shorter workweek a priority demand, negotiated a series of contracts with 12 extra holidays over a 2-year period. Although UAW President Leonard Woodcock sometimes opposed the 32-hour week as encouraging moonlighting, the UAW advertised the agreements as the opening wedge in its drive to make the 4-day, 32-hour week standard in the auto and farm equipment industries. Union dissidents, on the other hand, argued that little real increase in leisure had been achieved. 74. Early in 1977, over 50 local steel union presidents endorsed a 32-hour week just before the Sadlowski reform forces squared off with those led by Lloyd McBride in a hard-fought USW election. The New York Central Labor Council, with Harry Van Arsdale playing a prominent role, passed a 35-hour resolution in February, just as the AFL-CIO Executive Committee reaffirmed its support of that goal. 75 The Auto Workers Action Caucus meanwhile re-emphasized its commitment to 30 for 40. Kicking off a series of UAW resolute tie-ons for shorter hours prior to the union's May convention. At that convention, 300 delegates signed petitions supporting Michigan Congressman John Conyers' proposal, advanced in April 1977, for a law providing a 35-hour workweek, double time for overtime, a ban on compulsory overtime, and 35 for 40 in government contract-related employment. New UAW President Douglas Fraser told the convention that the 4-day week was inevitable, and said he would be delighted if the Conyers proposal passed. 76. Throughout the rest of 1977, shorter hours activity accelerated. In July, over 60 representatives of Iowa unions met in the Iowa Union Conference for shorter hours, demanding 35 for 40. The Illinois International Women's Year Conference adopted a similar resolution. 77 By October, when 50 local union officials from 11 states met in Detroit to launch the All Unions Committee to Shorten the Workweek, AUCSW. The machinists, fur workers and United Electrical Workers had assumed particularly instrumental roles, with steel, auto, longshore, retail clerks, mine, and government employee union officials also active. Frank Runnels, president of UAW Local 22, won the presidency of the new group, which launched plans for a broad April 1978 shorter hours conference. 78. The April conference drew 700 delegates from 200 locals and 25 international unions. It heard such labor luminaries as Fraser, Runnels, Frank Rosen, and Jim Balanoff address the hours issue, with Fraser promising, "As sure as I'm standing here, the American worker is going to have a 4-day work week without a cut in pay." The conferees also heard John Conyers explain the provisions of his H.R. 1784, a 35-hour workweek bill. They pledged support for H.R. 1784, over some opposition from Fraser and steel workers. Union officials, for abolition of all compulsory overtime, and for introduction of shorter hours with no pay reduction as a priority in bargaining for every international union. The AUCSW argued that each hour chopped from the 40-hour week translated into 1.4 million new jobs. 79. The campaign to make the 35-hour week a mass issue made slow gains after the April 1978 conference. In Illinois, over 24 union leaders from a dozen unions joined the Illinois Labor History Society endorsing a shorter hours rally to commemorate Haymarket. Iowa unionists were again especially active, initiating a summertime campaign on behalf of the Conyers bill. The United Electrical Workers National Convention gave top priority to the struggle to reduce hours, resolving, "We have to be prepared to wage a serious, determined and unrelenting campaign for legislation on the issue." 80. By 1979, such a campaign had developed enough to force hearings on Conyers' 35-hour amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act before the Subcommittee on Labor Standards of the House Committee on Education and Labor. Although the bill never reached the House floor, the hearings gathered labor and reform support, much of it coordinated by the AUCSW. 9 trade unionists as well as prominent economists and historians joined Detroit Mayor Coleman Young and other municipal officials in supporting the bill. The absence of top-level AFL-CIO leaders at the hearings meanwhile suggested the limits of AUCSW progress at mobilizing shorter hours support. 81. In the atmosphere of givebacks surrounding bargaining in the post-1981 recession, little hours progress has occurred. Jane Slaughter's assessment that union gains on shortening work time have been among the first to go during the concessions offensive may be an overstatement, although several unions have yielded to longer hours, sometimes in order to keep current weekly wages. Cutbacks in public spending have also led to lengthening hours for the thinned ranks of government employees in many areas. 82. However, at the same time, some unionists have argued that recession makes the anti-unemployment arguments for shorter hours more compelling and that shorter hours ought to be a concession demanded from employers. The Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union has led in making shorter hours union policy. Dissident steelworkers, leaders of the UAW Skilled Trades Council, unemployed groups, and activists grouped around the Labor Today newspaper have taken the same position. The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization strike, begun in June 1981 and broken at length by the U.S. government's use of strikebreakers and heavy fines on the union, illustrates many of the contradictory tendencies in contemporary hours struggles. The controllers' persistence in calling for a 32-hour week as a health and safety demand, the way that demand was lost in press treatments emphasizing wages, and the record of AFL-CIO unions in solidarity with the strike suggest the promise of both future action and inaction on the issue. 84. A lack of progress in the last 4 decades, and particularly in the last 3, raises the question of whether or not the shorter working day is an issue belonging to the dead past. For several reasons, we think that it is not and that possibilities of a renaissance are real. Among the hopeful signs are the growth of religious labor cooperation on the working day. Another possible constituency lies among family farmers, long opposed to a reduction in hours, but today among the Americans most likely to moonlight in a second job for wages. The demand can also appeal to young and minority workers, victims of massive unemployment. Moreover, recent Department of Labor studies show the average U.S. worker willing to forego 4.7% of his/her earnings in exchange for more leisure. 5. Employers also are likely to ensure that consciousness of the hours issue remains alive because of their insistence on rolling back existing hours gains and on denying privileges regarding breaks during the working day. In the 1979 organizing campaign at Sanderson Chicken Farms in Laurel, Mississippi, for exam PLE, among union demands were toilet breaks and 2 15-minute rest periods daily. 6. A major issue in the 110-day miners' strike of 1978 was management's resolve to deny Saturday overtime pay and to change other aspects of scheduling. In the 1981 cannery negotiations, a main concern of United Steel Workers negotiators was still abolition of the 12-hour day. The continuing presence of long hours coexists, as the Nobel Prize-winning economist Wassily Leontief has pointed out, with rapid mechanization creating a situation of ever-growing rates of structural unemployment not yet dented by policies other than a reduced workweek. 7. Finally, a reduction in working hours is a women's demand, or rather a human demand especially important to women because of their shouldering of child rearing and household responsibilities. In 1956, Elizabeth Lawson wrote, "While the labor movement fights for a working week of less than 40 hours, a large section of our population regularly, without vacations, and with no days off, puts in 100 hours a week or more, a longer working day than that against which American workers revolted more than a century ago. These are not sharecroppers or migratory workers. They are housewives." 8. Since 1940, the labor force participation rate of such housewives has risen from about 15% to just over 50%, the most spectacular recent demographic change in the workforce. The hours such women spend in housework have declined, but only marginally. 9. Women workers' sacrifices have heretofore functioned to smooth family problems regarding time as well as money. Female workers in 1975, for example, worked full-time for a full year in only 41.8% of all cases. Part-time workers comprised 32%, 26.3% were off full-time jobs much of the year. 90. In part these figures reflect sexist employment and layoff policies. But they also reflect pressured choices by women workers with family responsibilities. For such women to participate fully in the labor force, to avoid poorly paying part-time jobs, and to win promotions according to merit, a shorter work schedule enabling consistent labor is necessary. Or, to envision a different scenario, if men begin to share child rearing and household responsibilities more equally, the issue of shorter hours will be increasingly important to their wage earning and career potentials. In Norway and Sweden, where a resurgent 30-hour week movement has joined the shorter hours campaigns of German metalworkers in bringing working time to the fore as an issue in labor negotiations. Specifically, feminist arguments for a reduction in the workweek have found sophisticated, 91 expression. Scholarly researchers and labor organizers have agreed that women workers are most receptive to shorter hours arguments. 92 In the recent past of inaction on reducing hours, much of this interest has been translated into concern with such partial solutions as job sharing, flexitime, and providing full benefits for part-time workers. 93 Even so, unions with high percentages of women workers have made some of the major gains in negotiating shorter full-time workweeks. In healthcare, for example, the Service Employees International Union, the Communica-Tions Workers of America, and Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Local 1199 have all won schedules of substantially less than 40 hours. 94 If, as numerous observers of American labor have held, the organization of women is the key task determining the future of U.S. unions, it may be that shorter hours hold the key to such organization. It may even be that women workers, used to self-paced work at home and responsibilities with children, will again inject control issues into struggles over the working day. 95 For all these reasons, and in light of the rich past of workers' efforts to gain shore, there is little cause to quarrel with Andre Gorza's recent assessment. Nowhere is the line separating left and right clearer than on the question of time, the politics of time. According to whether it is a politics and policy of the right or left, it may lead either to a society based on unemployment or one based on free time. Of all the levers available to change the social order and the quality of life, this is one of the most powerful. 96